Titan Station holds more than 1 million lives in orbit around Saturn, and on the morning the lights start failing in the medical sector, most of those lives are asleep. The corridors of the station wind through what was once a moon, carved out and layered over until what began as an industrial wound in the surface of Titan became something that looked, from the inside, indistinguishable from a city. There are schools in the Sprawl, shopping centers, places of worship that draw thousands every week, apartment windows that look out at the rings of Saturn turning slowly in the dark. Children grow up there. Couples argue about the rent. People work jobs they are mostly indifferent to, come home to lives they mostly take for granted, and assume that the next morning will look something like the last one. The outbreak does not begin with something large. It starts the way most institutional catastrophes start, in a part of the building most people are not looking at, moving through the infrastructure in a space between classified information and public knowledge, gathering strength while the people responsible for containing it are still in the process of deciding whose job it officially is to contain it. By the time the alarm reaches the medical sector, the first hour of the worst disaster in the Sprawl's history has already passed. Most of the 1 million people still alive at that moment have no accurate information about what is happening to their station. Many of them will never get it. 3 years before that morning, a man named Isaac Clarke arrived on Titan Station in a condition that surviving medical logs describe, without elaboration, as catatonic. He had no memory of boarding the transport that brought him there, no recollection of the months between his escape from Aegis 7 and his arrival in this hospital. He did not know whose decision it had been to bring him here, what had been discussed about him in the rooms where that decision was made, or what was planned for him once the transport docked. He arrived with no agency, no information, and a mind imprinted by an alien signal that EarthGov had already decided was going to be useful to them. For 3 years, while Isaac Clarke slept in a padded room under sedation, that signal was carefully read, transcribed, and turned into something physical. He was not consulted about any of it. And the thing that was built from the information inside his head is the reason 1 million people are now running out of time. Dead Space 2 is one of the most precisely constructed horror sequels ever made, and it is frequently described primarily in terms of its gameplay, its improved mechanics, its voiced protagonist, and its shift from isolated industrial horror to something more expansive and civilized in setting. All of those descriptions are accurate, and none of them are the most interesting thing about it. The most interesting thing about it is its subject matter, which is the systematic exploitation of a traumatized person by every institution that claims, at various points, to be trying to help him. EarthGov extracts blueprints from Isaac's mind for 3 years while he sleeps. Unitology sends an agent to acquire him like a piece of property. The marker itself uses his grief for his dead girlfriend as the primary architecture for its own agenda. Even Nolan Strauss, the one other survivor who genuinely shares something with Isaac, is using him as a vehicle for his own attempt at resolution. The story of Dead Space 2 is the story of a man trying to reclaim his own mind from the systems that have been treating it as raw material. This is analytical commentary and critical interpretation of Dead Space 2's story, drawing on the established lore of the Dead Space universe, real-world frameworks from psychology and institutional history, and comparison across other fiction to examine what this story is doing underneath its surface. The facts about events, characters, and locations come from the game and its surrounding materials. The analysis is this channel's own. If something in this video resonates with you, drop a comment and let me know which part landed, whether it was a specific detail, a connection you made, or just a moment that stuck with you. A topic suggestion for the next video is always welcome as well. Some of the best ideas on this channel have come directly from the comments section. Now get comfortable, dim the lights if they are not already low. Let this story come to you rather than chasing it, and let us begin. Chapter 1: The 3 Lost Years. Isaac Clarke appears at the opening of Dead Space 2 in a straitjacket, being walked through a hospital corridor by a man he has apparently never consciously met, in a station he does not recognize. In a year he cannot immediately calculate. The man with him is named Franco, a character from a prequel story called Dead Space Ignition, and he has apparently been working to free Isaac from the facility before the outbreak overwhelms both of them. He manages to release one arm of Isaac's restraint before the necromorphs reach him. Isaac removes the rest of the jacket himself, alone in a corridor that is already beginning to fill with sounds that his body recognizes before his conscious mind catches up. The straitjacket is a small, specific detail that the story moves past in under 2 minutes. Worth pausing on it anyway, because it describes something larger than the immediate physical situation. A straitjacket is the mechanism by which a medical institution restrains a person who has been determined to be dangerous to themselves or others, removing that person's ability to use their own hands, their own arms, their own force. Isaac has been in one. The clear implication is that this was not a voluntary arrangement, that someone else decided it was necessary, that Isaac has been in a condition requiring that level of physical constraint for some period of time. The first image this story gives of its protagonist is a man who has been physically prevented from acting on his own behalf. Over the course of this story, the straitjacket will be replaced by more sophisticated forms of the same constraint. Titan Station, which the people who live there call the Sprawl, has a history that its current residents largely take for granted. In the early 26th century, the moon Titan orbiting Saturn was selected as the site of the first large-scale moon harvest, a precursor to the planet-cracking operations that would eventually become humanity's primary method of resource extraction. The operation broke Titan apart, leaving behind the shard on which Titan Station was subsequently constructed. The station built up over centuries around that remaining fragment, adding layers of residential, commercial, and governmental infrastructure until it became the densely populated city it is in the story's present. Its population exceeds 1 million. 1 million people is a number worth sitting with. The Ishimura disaster, which defined the first Dead Space story, killed hundreds. The colony on Aegis 7, another several thousand. The scope of what the Sprawl represents is categorically different. 1 million people means 1 million individual lives, individual routines, individual people who went to sleep the previous night, not knowing that the thing buried in the government sector, deep inside their station, was about to begin the process that would end most of them. The shift in setting, from Dead Space 1 to Dead Space 2, is not purely aesthetic. It is a deliberate escalation of the cost being attached to the same institutional decisions. The government sector is where Project Telomere was housed. Understanding Project Telomere is the key to understanding why the outbreak happens where and when it does, why Isaac specifically is on this station, and why the marker at the center of the disaster is not a relic dug up from some buried site, but a human construction built within the last 3 years in a research facility that the civilian population of the Sprawl had no knowledge of. The project began in the year 2508, 3 years before the outbreak, under the direct oversight of Hans Tiedemann, EarthGov's Director of Operations on Titan Station. Tiedemann had spent years running the station, and he understood better than most what the energy situation facing humanity actually looked like. Planet cracking, the method by which human civilization had been sustaining itself for 2 centuries, was becoming unsustainable. The resources were being consumed faster than new sites could be identified and processed. The colonies spread across human space were increasingly dependent on imports from a diminishing pool of viable extraction targets. The logs Tiedemann left in the government sector describe a man who had done the arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion that left him with very few options. Humanity needed a new energy source. The markers, which had demonstrated energy output that no human technology could approach, represented the only viable candidate he could identify. And EarthGov had, through the disasters at Aegis 7 and aboard the Ishimura, acquired something that nobody had managed to get their hands on before. A human being whose mind had been imprinted with a marker's blueprints, and who had survived the experience intact enough to still be useful. That human being was Isaac Clarke. EarthGov recovered Isaac after his escape from Aegis 7 and transported him to Titan Station. His mental state at the time of recovery was, by all available accounts, severely deteriorated. The hallucinations that the marker's signal had been generating inside his head had not stopped when he left the Ishimura. They had simply changed character, becoming more intrusive, more insistent, organized around the image of Nicole Brennan in ways that were growing increasingly disconnected from anything Isaac could have predicted or controlled. The dementia that is the marker signal's primary mechanism for influencing organic minds had been progressing through Isaac's brain for weeks, accelerated by the direct contact he had made with the marker on Aegis 7. A less scrupulous reading of Isaac's arrival at Titan Station would describe EarthGov as providing medical care for a severely traumatized man. The more accurate reading is that EarthGov identified an asset, recovered it, and placed it in a containment facility that offered the appearance of medical management while serving the primary purpose of keeping the asset stable enough to be regularly accessed. The method of access was the Noonlight Diagnostic Machine, a device located in the government sector's research facility that extracted information from the patient's brain by inserting a needle through the ocular cavity into the lateral geniculate nucleus. This region of the brain is the primary processing center for visual information, and it is also, in individuals with marker-induced dementia, where the marker's encoded blueprints appear to be stored. The visual system is where the signal lives. Researchers studying the imprinted subjects found that the marker's instructions organize themselves around the neural pathways associated with sight, which explains why every person touched by a marker starts seeing things. The signal uses the visual system as its operating environment, encoding its data in the same neural architecture the brain uses to process what the eyes report. By accessing the lateral geniculate nucleus directly, EarthGov's team could read and record the algorithmic patterns stored there. Session by session, across 3 years, they extracted enough of what was encoded in Isaac's brain to construct a physical marker. The Site-12 marker, as it came to be designated, was described as a fully expressed physical representation of the algorithms embedded in Isaac's mind. It was the largest marker ever constructed by human hands, built in the station's government sector from layers of mineral printing baths, grown layer by layer according to the blueprints EarthGov had extracted from the mind of a man who did not know they were taking them. To ensure that Isaac would not remember any of this, and to slow the dementia that the sessions were simultaneously accelerating, EarthGov administered memory suppressants after each extraction. The logic of this was operationally convenient. A subject who cannot remember being used is a subject who cannot object, cannot report it to any outside authority, cannot build any kind of protective response to the process. The memory suppression was presented in the internal project documentation as a therapeutic measure designed to manage the subject's psychological well-being. In practice, it served EarthGov's research program by removing the most significant source of potential disruption, the subjects themselves. This pattern has historical precedent outside of fiction, and it is worth naming because the parallel is unusually precise. In the 1950s and 60s, the United States Central Intelligence Agency operated a program of classified research into behavioral modification, mind control, and the manipulation of human cognition. The program, designated MK-Ultra, ran across dozens of institutions and involved hundreds of subjects, many of whom had no knowledge that they were participating in research at all. Participants included patients receiving treatment at hospitals and clinics who were administered psychoactive substances, subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, and exposed to prolonged sensory deprivation procedures without their knowledge or informed consent. The stated justification was national security. American intelligence agencies were convinced that enemy powers were developing similar capabilities, and the program was framed internally as a defensive necessity, a way of understanding vulnerabilities in human cognition before adversaries could exploit them. The researchers involved were not, by most accounts, sadists. They were scientists operating within institutional frameworks that had already decided the research was necessary, and that the necessity of the research was sufficient justification for the method of conducting it. When the program was eventually exposed and investigated, the most striking feature of the testimony from surviving participants was the contrast between their descriptions of their experiences and the institutional records that described the same events in clinical, administrative language that gave no indication that harm was being caused. Tiedemann's Project Telomere follows this shape. His logs describe the extraction sessions in the same administrative language: patient stability, data integrity, research milestones, project timelines. The needle through the eye does not appear in the language his logs use to describe the research. The subject's experiences during and between sessions do not appear in the language either. What appears is the progress of the marker's construction, the quality of the algorithmic data being extracted, and periodic assessments of whether the subject's mental states were stable enough to continue being useful. Isaac was designated Patient 4 in Project Telomere's records. This designation confirmed that there were at least 3 others alongside him, patients whose information was apparently insufficient, or who deteriorated too quickly, or who simply did not survive the process long enough to provide what the project needed. The records do not detail what happened to patients 1, 2, and 3. Their absence from the story's surviving cast of characters offers a working hypothesis. What the 3 years in the hospital actually did to Isaac's mind is something the story makes visible slowly through the progression of his dementia symptoms as he regains his memories over the course of the game. The memory suppressants had contained the worst of the marker signal's influence, creating a kind of temporary floor beneath which his condition could not easily descend. But they had not stopped the signal's underlying work. The padded walls of his cell, visible in a brief glimpse during the game's opening, are covered in marker symbols drawn in his own handwriting during periods his conscious mind cannot access. This detail is important. During the suppressant-controlled gaps in his awareness, Isaac's brain had been receiving the marker's signal and producing responses to it, drawing, writing, scrawling the same shapes across every available surface. The man who woke up in the straitjacket had been doing this for 3 years, in a room he could not leave, and had no memory of any of it. The neurological reality of memory suppression makes this more disturbing, not less. When the brain's explicit memory system, the system responsible for forming and retrieving conscious, declarative memories, is pharmacologically disrupted, the implicit and emotional memory systems continue operating. Habits form, emotional responses to stimuli develop and strengthen, skills are acquired and refined. A person can be trained to respond in specific ways, to perform specific tasks, to feel specific emotions towards specific triggers, and then have the explicit memory of that training removed, leaving only the response patterns in place. The brain learns without the person knowing it learned anything. Isaac had spent 3 years being shaped by the marker's signal in exactly this environment. His conscious mind could not report on what had happened. The shaping had happened anyway. This sets up something that will not become fully clear until the story's final chapters, and it is worth planting it here early. By the time Isaac regains enough memory to understand what has been done to him, the question of where the marker's influence ends and his own mind begins has no clean answer. The line was already blurred before he ever stepped onto the Ishimura. 3 years of Project Telomere's sessions had blurred it further. What Isaac thinks of as his own grief, his own guilt, his own love for Nicole, are all real things. They are also, simultaneously, the operating environment that the marker signal installed itself into when it first touched him. Real emotions carrying an alien agenda do not become less real because something else is using them. They also do not become less useful to whatever is using them. There is a clock running through the opening of this story that none of the characters have access to. The marker, now complete, is already influencing the minds of everyone near it, producing exactly the pattern of mass hallucination, psychological deterioration, and accumulated violence that an active marker generates wherever it is placed. Tiedemann's project protocols had always included provisions for a containment failure. He had planned, to the extent planning for this was possible, around the assumption that the marker's energy could eventually be harvested and controlled. The convergence event, the endgame process by which an active marker uses accumulated biomass to complete something larger than itself, was a known risk that EarthGov had not successfully developed a method of preventing. What Tiedemann could not fully account for was the scale of what an active marker of this size would do when placed in proximity to 300,000 people. The civilian population of the Sprawl began experiencing the marker's influence gradually in the weeks and months before the outbreak. Accident rates increased in the Titan mines. Incidents of unexplained violence spiked across the station. Sleep disturbances spread through the population clusters closest to the government sector. Nobody at the civilian level knew that EarthGov was running a classified marker research program in the facility beneath their station. The Necromorph infestation began in the Titan mines below the government sector and spread upward. By the time the first alarms reached the surface levels where most of the population lived, the vector of the outbreak had already moved through multiple containment barriers that Project Telomere's protocols had designated as redundant safeguards. Each one of those safeguards had been designed around an assumption about what a controlled marker research environment would look like. The actual situation by the time Isaac Clarke woke up was the inevitable product of what happened when those assumptions proved incorrect. Franco's death, within the first 2 minutes of this story, is a small piece of what the broader scope of the disaster looks like. He was one person trying to do something specific and useful in the middle of something far larger than any individual act of assistance could address. His death also leaves Isaac without the one person who had accurate knowledge of what was happening and why. Whatever information Franco had about the Sprawl, the outbreak, and Isaac's own situation died with him, leaving Isaac to reconstruct his understanding of his circumstances from fragments of recovered memory and the voices of whoever chose to contact him next. The first such voice is already waiting. Chapter 2. The Uses of a Desperate Man. A woman named Dana Le Guin makes contact with Isaac through his Riggs communication link within minutes of Franco's death. Her timing is precise. The window of Isaac's maximum vulnerability, a man who has just watched the only person helping him die, who is surrounded by necromorphs in a facility he does not recognize, who has no memory of the last 3 years and no immediate framework for understanding what is happening to him, is exactly the window she occupies. Her tone is controlled, specific, helpful. She identifies herself as someone who knows about his condition. She uses terminology that demonstrates accurate knowledge of what EarthGov has been doing to him. She tells him that she has a way to remove the marker blueprints from his mind, which will slow his dementia and potentially save his life. She knows about the Noonlight diagnostics machine. She knows that his dementia is progressing, and that without intervention, it will eventually consume him the same way it is consuming Nolan Strauss in another part of the hospital. The information is accurate. The offer built on top of that information is not. Dana is a unitologist agent operating under instructions from the Church of Unitology's leadership on the Sprawl. Her mission is to recover Isaac Clarke and bring him to the Church's control, because Unitology has determined that Isaac's marker-encoded mind is exactly the resource it needs to pursue its own agenda. That agenda, at this point in the story, involves using Isaac to build additional markers that the Church can use to accelerate the convergence event across human space, which Unitology's theology has designated as a form of transcendence. The Church does not believe, at its institutional level, that the necromorphs are something to be survived. It believes they are the mechanism of a divine transformation that the markers are designed to initiate. Isaac, who is hearing Dana's voice as a rope thrown to a man in water, follows her guidance across the station toward the Unitology Church, where she is waiting. He encounters Nolan Strauss along the way, another patient from the hospital, who has also escaped into the outbreak and who is trying, in his deteriorating and fragmented way, to communicate something about how to destroy the marker. Isaac chooses to ignore Strauss and continue toward Dana, which is a reasonable decision in the moment. Strauss is clearly in a far more advanced stage of dementia than Isaac. His communications are disorganized and erratic, and the promise Dana is holding out is both clearer and more immediately actionable than anything Strauss seems capable of offering. Upon Isaac's arrival at the church, the full nature of Dana's mission becomes visible in the space of a few seconds. Her agents seize Isaac. She explains what she and the church want from him, and then, before any of that plan can advance further, EarthGov gunships arrive outside the church and open fire on the exterior, killing Dana and her men, destroying the unitologist operation before it has had time to produce anything useful. The gunship arrives because EarthGov is tracking Isaac, the same institution that held him for 3 years and is now hunting him across the outbreak, has not lost interest simply because he escaped the hospital. To EarthGov, Isaac represents a unique and irreplaceable research asset. The blueprints in his mind were used to construct the Site-12 marker, but the source is now loose in a disaster zone, and the possibility that Unitology might acquire him before EarthGov can recontain him is an unacceptable outcome. Tiedeman's security forces are deployed not to rescue Isaac from the outbreak, but to ensure that nobody else gets to him before EarthGov decides what to do with him next. Both institutions want the same thing. Both are willing to use violence to secure it. Neither is offering Isaac anything that resembles genuine assistance with his actual situation. Dana was lying. EarthGov is hunting. Strauss, the one voice that might have been offering something real, was so disorganized that Isaac initially dismissed him. This is the shape of the world Isaac Clarke has woken into. 2 powerful institutions fighting over him as a commodity. A third option too damaged to communicate clearly. And no neutral space where his own interests can be addressed outside of anyone else's agenda. The experience of being fought over by competing institutions while being treated as an object rather than a person has a real-world dimension worth examining, and it appears most clearly in contexts where a person's condition or circumstance gives them value to systems that profit from their management rather than their recovery. Research on institutional care for individuals with severe trauma consistently finds that the systems ostensibly designed to help such individuals frequently organize themselves around the needs and interests of the institution first, with the individual's well-being positioned as a secondary concern that will be addressed once the institutional priorities are satisfied. The individual in this arrangement is often not in a position to object, either because their condition limits their capacity to advocate for themselves, or because the power differential between an individual patient and the institution holding them is simply too large to be effectively challenged from inside. Isaac's situation extends this pattern to an institutional scale, with 2 entire organizations competing for control of one person, neither of which is constrained by any external accountability structure that could meaningfully intervene. The disaster unfolding around him removes any possibility of recourse to outside authorities. There is no regulator to contact. There is no independent oversight. There is only the outbreak, 2 institutions fighting through it, and one man trying to figure out what is real. After Dana's death and the destruction of the Unitology operation, Isaac has no choice but to reconsider Strauss, the reluctant alliance that forms between them, with Strauss claiming to know the steps needed to destroy the marker, and Isaac possessing the engineering capability to actually execute them, is the practical core around which the rest of the story organizes itself. But it is an alliance built on 2 people who are each, in their own way, operating with significant limitations on what they can actually access about their own situation. The marker's influence on both of them is not a constant, static presence. It is a dynamic one, shifting in character and intensity, based on what each man is doing and where he is relative to the marker's physical location. As Isaac moves deeper into the sprawl and closer to the government sector, the signal grows stronger. His dementia symptoms, which were suppressed by 3 years of medication and which had been relatively manageable in the first hours after waking, will gradually intensify as he moves toward the thing that was built from his mind. Before getting to what that intensification looks like, and what it does to both men, there is something in the machinery of how the marker was actually constructed that deserves its own examination, because the process by which EarthGov built the Site-12 marker is not just relevant to the plot mechanics of this story. It reveals something about what the marker's signal actually is, and what that means for every person it has touched. The marker did not simply affect Isaac's mind, it used his mind, and what it used him to build was not just a physical structure. It was a more perfect version of itself, designed to complete something that the original artifact at Chicxulub had set in motion 300 years before Isaac Clarke was born. That explanation requires understanding what Project Telomere scientists actually found when they started reading Isaac's brain, and what they found eventually started reading them back. Chapter 3. What the scientists didn't expect. Nolan Strauss was not always the person Isaac encounters in the first hours of this story. Before the hospital on the Sprawl, before the disorganized radio communications and the fragments of information delivered in the wrong order, before the deterioration that will eventually make him dangerous to everyone around him, he was a senior scientist aboard a vessel called the USM Abraxas, capable enough in his field to have been assigned the kind of task that required both expertise and clearance. His ship was part of the operation that moved through the aftermath of the Ishimura disaster, and what he recovered from the wreckage around Aegis 7 was a shard of the original marker, a fragment of the same alien artifact whose signal had erased a colony and destroyed the most powerful planet cracker humanity had ever built. Strauss documented his initial findings with apparent care, filed the appropriate reports, spent a period of time that reads, from the outside, like legitimate scientific curiosity about an unprecedented object. The marker signal does not announce itself with something dramatic. It establishes itself gradually in the nervous system, then expands outward through incremental escalation, anomalous dreams first, then intermittent intrusive imagery, then the compulsive behaviors that precede full dementia. By the time Strauss could have identified what was happening as a medical emergency requiring outside response, the signal had progressed far enough that his capacity for that identification had already been impaired. This is one of the more elegant features of the marker's influence as a system. The mechanism that would generate the most resistance to its spread is the first thing it disables. Under the shard's influence, Strauss eventually reached the stage that destroyed him not physically, but in every way that matters to a person's ability to continue being who they were. The marker's acute hallucinatory phase, in which the signal generates perceptions so total that they override whatever sensory information the eyes are actually receiving, caused him to see his wife Alexis and their infant son as necromorphs rather than the people they were. He killed them. A crew member named Isabel Cho found him in the aftermath and brought him to other survivors. He told those survivors that the necromorphs were what they were supposed to be, which is the kind of sentence a person produces when the marker's ideology has colonized their reasoning while just enough cognitive function remains to generate spoken words in grammatically organized form. He was eventually transported to Titan Station, placed in the psychiatric facility, and enrolled in Project Telomere as Patient Zero. The guilt Strauss carries into that hospital and carries through every step of this story is worth distinguishing from Isaac's guilt carefully, because the difference explains why the two men end up at such different points, even though they share the same exposure history, the same 3 years of extraction sessions, and the same deteriorating relationship with their own minds. Isaac carries grief and guilt for Nicole, real and overwhelming grief, the kind shaped by a last conversation that left things unresolved, and a persuasion that sent her to a place where she could not survive. His guilt lives in the architecture of unresolved possibility. Different choices, made with more information, might have produced different outcomes. He did not kill Nicole. He could not have reached the Ishimura in time to change what happened. The guilt is genuine, and it is enormous, and it has a shape that can eventually be examined, approached from multiple angles, and potentially integrated into a story about the self that leaves room for something other than total condemnation. Strauss's guilt has none of that architecture. He remembers what he did to his family. There is no counterfactual distance available to him. No argument that different information would have produced different choices, because his hands did what they did with enough conscious coordination to count as deliberate, even though his mind was not functioning in any way that ordinary moral reasoning could accommodate. The marker uses this wound the same way it uses Isaac's grief for Nicole, as the path of least resistance into the subject's deepest emotional material. But what is on the other side of Strauss's particular door is more raw, more recently formed, and more completely resistant to any reframing that might reduce its destructive potential. The signal has more purchase in a mind already shredded by undeniable atrocity than in a mind working through grief that has not yet been fully confronted. Isaac's dementia is progressing. Strauss's dementia had a head start. This distinction matters more than it initially appears. It means that what Isaac sees when he watches Strauss deteriorate across this story is not simply a man in a worse version of his own situation. He is watching an accelerated version of a specific future possibility, a demonstration of what happens when the marker's signal is given a more vulnerable host and allowed to run further toward its natural conclusion. Strauss is doing, in the time frame of one outbreak, what Isaac's dementia has the potential to do over a longer arc. Every conversation Isaac has with him, every moment of Strauss's disorganization and violence and eventual complete collapse, is also a preview of something Isaac has not yet been forced to directly confront about what might be waiting inside his own head. Keep that in mind as this story continues. Because the thing Strauss is working toward telling Isaac, the steps that he claims will allow them to destroy the marker, is not organized enough to be immediately useful, but is also not, as Isaac initially assumes, simply the incoherence of a man whose mind has already gone too far. Strauss has something real. He also has a wound that the marker is actively using against him, and by the time Isaac understands what the steps actually require, Strauss will no longer be in a condition to help with anything. Now let us pull the camera back from the individual subjects and look at what was happening in the research facility around them during those 3 years, because this is where this story takes a turn that tends to get under-discussed even by people who know the broader lore well. Project Telomere employed scientists and engineers alongside its research subjects. The team required people capable of operating the Noonlight diagnostics machine, of interpreting the neural data the machine extracted, of translating those algorithmic patterns into the physical construction protocols for the Site-12 marker. Hans Tiedemann was the head of the project, the primary architect of the scientific method that allowed EarthGov to convert what was living in Isaac's brain into a set of blueprints for a physical object. His logs, scattered across the government sector's terminals in the later stages of the game, document the progress of the research from a perspective that is external to the subjects, but not, as it turns out, external to the signal. Phelps's early logs read like the documentation of a scientist doing genuinely complex work with appropriate rigor. The patterns in Isaac's brain readings were described as clear enough to play back without ambiguity. The algorithmic structure organized in a way that made the extraction process efficient. His team celebrated when they finally produced a workable set of blueprints, documented the progress of the marker's physical construction in meticulous detail, and appeared from the inside to be conducting legitimate scientific research according to the standards of their institutional context. The later logs read differently. By the time the marker's construction was approaching completion, Phelps was documenting something he could not explain within the framework of his research parameters. The patterns from Isaac's brain sessions had begun appearing in his own thoughts between sessions. The algorithms he had spent months studying and transcribing were, as he described it, playing back in his mind of their own accord, intruding on his sleep, reorganizing themselves into shapes that seemed, in ways he found increasingly difficult to articulate, to be pointing toward something. He had taken the standard chemical suppressants designed to prevent dementia progression in subjects with direct marker contact. He had not anticipated that indirect exposure, through the careful, academically rigorous study of another person's marker-encoded neural data, might constitute a form of contact in its own right. This detail is one of the more genuinely unsettling structural elements of the Site-12 marker's construction. The signal does not require direct physical contact with a marker to establish itself in a susceptible mind. Sustained, intensive engagement with the patterns that constitute the signal, reading them, transcribing them, modeling them into physical form, appears to have been sufficient to establish a reduced version of the same influence in Phelps and potentially other members of the research team. The marker, through the medium of Isaac Clarke's extracted neural data, had effectively extended its reach into the minds of the people who were studying it, without any of those people ever touching a marker directly. There is a real-world framework for understanding this kind of indirect transmission, and it comes not from physics or biology, but from trauma psychology. Researchers who work intensively with traumatic material, forensic investigators reviewing crime scene documentation, therapists who treat survivors of extreme violence, journalists embedded in conflict zones, first responders whose work brings them into sustained contact with others suffering, have documented a specific pattern of symptoms that develops over time in the absence of any personal traumatic event. The condition has several names in clinical literature, secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma being the most commonly used, and its signature is the appearance of trauma-like symptoms in someone who has never been directly traumatized. Intrusive imagery, sleep disturbance, hypervigilance, a gradual erosion of the person's sense of safety about the world, produced not by anything they personally experienced, but by sustained, close engagement with other people's worst experiences. The mechanism, as researchers have theorized it, involves the brain's tendency to simulate experiences it is processing, rather than simply cataloging them. Engaging deeply with another person's trauma does not leave the engaging mind unchanged. It leaves patterns, echoes, neural impressions of material that never belonged to the processing mind in the first place, but that now occupy space in it regardless. Phelps was doing something structurally similar with the marker's signal, engaging deeply over months with patterns that had been extracted from a mind the signal had already colonized. His brain was simulating those patterns rather than simply recording them, and the marker's signal, which appears to operate by establishing itself in the visual processing system and expanding outward, found exactly the kind of receptive environment in Phelps's intensive, repeated engagement that it finds in subjects with direct exposure. He was not touched by a marker. He was touched by Isaac Clarke's experience of being touched by a marker, transmitted through the medium of data that he had spent months reading carefully. By the time the Site 12 marker was complete, Phelps's logs describe a man who had lost the clear delineation between his own thinking and the patterns he had been studying. He could no longer identify with confidence which thoughts were his own and which were intrusions from the data. The suppressants he was taking had not been calibrated for his kind of exposure. The project protocols had not included this as a recognized risk. This is the dimension of Project Telomere that should be understood alongside Tiedemann's decision-making in the final stages of the story. The research program did not produce a controlled, academically managed marker replica under careful institutional oversight. It produced a marker, and in the process of producing that marker, extended its signal into at least some of the researchers who built it. The facility in the government sector, by the time the outbreak began, was not just housing a dangerous object, it was housing a collection of people who had been gradually changed by the process of creating it, in ways that neither they nor Tiedemann fully understood. Under research protocols that had never anticipated this particular failure mode, Tiedemann's logs document his awareness that the marker's construction carried risk. He understood, at an institutional level, that a convergence event was a possibility that project protocols needed to account for. He had signed off on protocols forbidding the evacuation of the Sprawl's civilian population in the event of a breach, a decision made specifically to protect the research from outside interference during any potential containment failure. The protocols existed because EarthGov had modeled the scenarios and determined that the research was too important to the species' survival to risk interrupting, even if a breach occurred. What Tiedemann could not have fully modeled was the scenario in which the marker's signal had already been doing its work on the researchers inside the facility during the years of construction, and in which those researchers, by the time a breach occurred, were not operating with the full cognitive clarity that the protocols had assumed they would bring to the process of managing a controlled disaster. The protocols were written assuming that the humans implementing them would be genuinely different from the subjects of the research. By the end of 3 years of Project Telomere, That assumption had been quietly invalidated. There is something here that connects back to the larger pattern this story keeps returning to. The institutions in Dead Space 2 do not fail because they are staffed by unusual people making unusual choices. They fail because the assumptions built into their design do not survive contact with what they are actually working with. EarthGov designed Project Telomere, assuming that the marker's influence could be contained within the research subjects, while the researchers themselves remained outside its reach. The marker did not recognize that boundary. The signal went where the signal went, and the humans managing the project were simply not watching for what was happening to themselves. That is what was building in the government sector, while Isaac slept in the hospital above it. Now here is what none of the Project Telomere documentation had any category for. The marker that was built from Isaac's mind, once constructed, began doing something that its builders had anticipated theoretically, but had not successfully contained practically. It extended its signal into the surrounding population. Every mind within range of an active marker receives the signal at some level. The Site 12 marker, which was described as the largest marker ever constructed, had a correspondingly expanded effective range. The civilian population of the Sprawl, who had been told nothing about what was being built in the facility beneath their station, had been receiving that signal for as long as the marker had been active. How long the marker had been operational before the outbreak began is not completely clear from surviving records, but the pattern of behavioral data from the months before, the incident reports from the Titan mines, the spike in station-wide accidents and unexplained violence, the documented increase in sleep disturbances and psychotic episodes across the residential sectors closest to the government sector, all point to a population that had been receiving a signal it had no framework for understanding and no institutional support for managing. Before getting to the people navigating that outside, the station proper, and everyone who is neither a research subject nor a government employee. It is worth pausing briefly here, because what has just been described, the marker signal spreading from research subjects to researchers to the general population, represents a particular kind of institutional failure that has a specific name in the literature on complex systems. It is called a cascade, and it happens when a risk that was designed to be contained in one part of a system crosses the boundaries that were supposed to keep it there, and the crossing of those boundaries makes it more likely that further boundaries will also be crossed, until the containment structure that was supposed to protect everything from the risk has itself become the mechanism by which the risk spreads. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1979 produced the first widely documented public case study of exactly this pattern. A series of equipment failures and human errors compounded each other across multiple systems in a nuclear reactor, each one happening in part because the previous one had changed the conditions inside the plant in ways that made the next failure more likely. The operators managing the crisis were working with training and protocols designed for scenarios that did not match what they were actually seeing, and the gap between their trained responses and the actual situation allowed the cascade to advance through several safeguard layers before anyone fully understood what they were dealing with. The parallel to what happened on Titan Station is not about nuclear technology. It is about the structural dynamics of a cascade failure inside a complex system, and how that dynamic makes institutional oversight nearly impossible once it has progressed past a certain threshold. By the time the Necromorph infestation moved from the Titan mines into the hospital sector, the cascade had already crossed enough of Project Telomere's designed containment boundaries that Tiedemann's available responses were largely reactive rather than preventive. He was managing something that had already escaped management. He was also managing it with a team of researchers whose cognitive states he could not fully evaluate, in a facility whose security apparatus was being consumed by the outbreak from below, in a situation where the protocols he had spent 3 years designing were revealing their own gaps in real time. Tiedemann himself will become increasingly relevant as this story progresses toward its ending. But before following Isaac through what remains of the Sprawl's public areas, through the escalating chaos of the outbreak above the government sector's buried research complex, There is one more element of the marker's architecture that deserves close attention, because the signal that Project Telomere spent 3 years reading out of Isaac Clarke's brain was not simply a set of construction blueprints. It was, according to the pattern that every marker in the Dead Space universe has followed since the events at Chicxulub, a set of instructions for a specific purpose, and that purpose was never the one EarthGov had assigned to it. The marker's relationship to convergence is the part of this story that most directly addresses what the signal actually is, beyond its effects on human minds. Convergence, as the unitologists understand it in their theological framework and as the research at Project Telomere confirmed in its operational data, is the endgame toward which an active marker's entire behavioral pattern has been oriented. Everything the marker does to the minds around it, the dementia, the hallucinations, the compulsive drawing and symbol writing, the gradual replacement of individual psychology with an alien agenda, is not incidental to what the marker is. It is the method by which the marker accomplishes what it is designed to accomplish. The signal does not accidentally produce necromorphs from the biomass around it. The signal actively works toward that production, using the minds it can access as both construction materials and behavioral guides, steering the people it has touched toward the accumulation of additional biomass near the marker's location. Isaac Clarke, standing in the outbreak on the Sprawl, with 3 years of memory missing, and a dementia he cannot fully feel yet, has been steered by the Site-12 marker for the entirety of his time on Titan Station. He did not know he was being steered. He did not consent to the steering, and the hallucination of Nicole Brennan that begins accompanying him through the Sprawl's corridors is not, as it might initially appear, purely a product of his own grief. That is something to hold carefully as the story continues, because the nature of what the Nicole hallucination actually is in this story, what it represents, how it changes across the game, and what it ultimately requires of Isaac, is the most psychologically specific and most emotionally demanding element of everything this narrative does. Getting there requires first understanding what the rest of the Sprawl looks like to the people who are not infected by the marker's direct signal, but who are dying anyway. If you are still with me at this point, the next section is where the scale of what the marker has been building toward becomes fully visible, and what it looks like from the outside of EarthGov's classified operations changes how everything that comes before it should be understood. Chapter 4: 1 Million People, One Burning Station. Ellie Langford does not need the marker's signal to have a crisis. She is having one entirely on her own terms by the time Isaac encounters her in the commercial district of the Sprawl, firing at necromorphs with a pulse rifle, and not particularly interested in slowing down to explain herself to anyone. Her credentials are straightforward: a Class 4 pilot under the Concordance Extraction Corporation's employment, which in practice means she operates and repairs the kind of large industrial machinery that runs the Sprawl's mining operations. She is competent, direct, and currently making decisions that are keeping her alive in an environment that has killed most of the people she was working with before Isaac found her. The first moments of their interaction establish something that becomes quietly important across the rest of the story. Ellie fires at Isaac before she knows who he is, because the operating assumption in a necromorph outbreak is that any unexpected approaching figure is a threat, and the assumption has been repeatedly confirmed for her in the hours before they meet. She then assesses the situation with the speed of someone who has spent time in dangerous industrial environments and learned to read shifting conditions quickly. She decides that Isaac is useful to her survival. She does not decide that he is trustworthy, and she does not pretend that this is a circumstance that requires anything warmer than a functional alliance. Ellie is the character in this story who provides the clearest window into what the Sprawl's disaster looks like from the perspective of someone without a direct relationship to the marker or to the institutions fighting over its control. Her crisis is purely situational, a working professional who went to her shift on a station she expected to be stable and found it consuming itself, who has been making survival decisions at full operational speed with no access to the classified information that explains what she is actually dealing with. Her competence does not come from marker-touched neural imprinting, or EarthGov training, or unitologist theology. It comes from knowing how to operate heavy machinery in dangerous environments, how to assess structural risk in large-scale industrial settings, and how to make fast decisions when the consequences of hesitation are immediate. This makes Ellie the character whose presence in the story is most grounding, in the literal sense. She cannot hallucinate Nicole. She does not have dementia. She has not been subjected to 3 years of memory suppression or neural extraction sessions. What she has is a working set of survival instincts and enough situational intelligence to recognize, fairly quickly, that the two men she has been forced to associate herself with are each carrying damage that is going to make them unpredictable in specific ways, and that managing that unpredictability is part of what keeping herself alive is going to require. Her arc across the first 2/3 of the story runs parallel to Isaac's without being the same story. She is surviving the same disaster, moving through the same station, dealing with the same immediate threats. Her relationship to those threats is different in kind from Isaac's, because his relationship to the marker has been building for years while hers began about 6 hours ago. Watching the story through Ellie's eyes, even partially, reveals something about what the Sprawl's disaster looks like when stripped of the marker's psychological dimension. It looks like a civilization failing faster than any individual can manage. The Sprawl's physical reality is worth describing, because the setting does a significant amount of narrative work that is easy to absorb as background texture, without fully registering what it is communicating. The station is not just large, it is a complete civilization in miniature, built on top of a moon fragment, organized around the same social and economic structures that any large human settlement develops when it has existed long enough to develop them. There are wealthy districts and working-class districts, public transit routes that connect different sectors, commercial areas designed for leisure as well as commerce, a unitologist church that occupies a prominent and architecturally significant space in the station's layout, large enough to serve a substantial portion of the civilian population and prominent enough that its spire is visible from several other major sectors. That church deserves attention in its own right, because the unitologist presence on the Sprawl is not incidental to why the outbreak takes the shape it takes. Unitology on the Sprawl is not a fringe community. It is an organized institution with resources, membership, and infrastructure integrated into the station's civilian life. The tension between unitology and EarthGov that Dana's betrayal revealed was not a sudden conflict. It had been developing across the 3 years of Project Telomere. As unitology's intelligence about EarthGov's classified research grew, and as the theological significance of what EarthGov was building became clear to the church's leadership, a marker being constructed from a human mind, in the center of a station with a substantial unitologist population, is either a religious event or a security threat, depending entirely on whose institutional framework you apply to it. For unitology's leadership, it was a religious event that EarthGov was attempting to control for purely secular, extractive purposes. The church's response, including Dana's mission and the apparent unitologist role in accelerating, or at minimum not interfering with the outbreak's spread, is the behavior of an institution that has decided the marker's convergence is something to be encouraged rather than prevented. The Necromorphs, in unitology's theology, are not the disaster. They are the fulfillment of a promise, the physical manifestation of the unity after death that the marker's inscriptions have always described. This means that the Sprawl's civilian population during the outbreak is caught between 3 different institutional responses: EarthGov's security forces, trying to protect the research and contain the situation according to protocols that were inadequate before the outbreak began; unitologist agents, actively attempting to accelerate what they believe is a divine event; and the Necromorphs themselves, which are not an institution but which function as one, in the sense that they operate with a consistent goal: the accumulation and transformation of biological material in proximity to the marker, that overrides every individual variation among the organisms pursuing it. The million people of the Sprawl, are not protagonists of any of these three narratives. They are the environment in which all three are playing out simultaneously. Ellie is one of them. Her survival across the story's events, her eventual role in Isaac's escape, her capacity to make decisions that are not distorted by the marker's signal or by institutional allegiance, is partly a function of the fact that she entered this situation with none of the prior investment that shapes Isaac's and Strauss's responses to everything around them. Tiedemann's decision-making in the first hours of the outbreak illustrates the limits of institutional authority during a cascade failure with almost painful clarity. He ordered the evacuation of the station's civilians once he confirmed that the Necromorph infestation had spread beyond the Titan station mines, going against the direct orders of his EarthGov superiors, who had classified protocols forbidding evacuation in the event of a breach. This decision, which saved some civilian lives, was simultaneously a decision to continue protecting the Site-12 marker from the outbreak, rather than using EarthGov's resources to address the outbreak directly. The evacuation was partial, the research was not abandoned. A man who has spent 3 years building something he genuinely believed was humanity's only remaining hope, in a facility hidden from the public, using methods that required him to make ethical decisions he could not acknowledge making, confronting the collapse of the control framework that he had organized everything around. The logs he left before the final confrontation described someone who had not, even in the face of the evidence accumulating around him, fully revised his belief that the research was justified and that EarthGov was close enough to a practical application of the marker's technology that the cost would eventually seem worth bearing. This belief structure, the conviction that a harmful program is justified by the magnitude of the benefit being sought, has been documented in the reasoning of people responsible for institutional disasters across several different historical contexts. The researchers at Stanford in the early 1970s ran a study in which college students randomly assigned to roles of prisoner and guard in a simulated prison environment began behaving, within days, in ways that required the study to be terminated early. The lead researcher later described the process by which the study's institutional logic progressively overrode his capacity to evaluate the experiment's effects on participants from outside that logic. The study had its own internal momentum, its own institutional justification structure, and extracting oneself from that structure to assess it accurately required the kind of external perspective that the study's design had systematically prevented from existing inside itself. Tiedemann had been inside Project Telomere's logic for 3 years. The project's justification had been reinforced at every step by its own success metrics. The marker's construction was progressing, the data extraction was producing results, the research was advancing. Within that framework, the distress of the research subjects was a cost to be managed. The threat of a convergence event was a risk to be mitigated, and the continued operation of the program was the only available path to the outcome that justified all of it. The outbreak stripped Tiedemann's institutional framework of its ability to maintain its own coherence. The cost he had been managing was no longer an abstraction expressed in research subject health assessments. It was in the corridors. It was consuming his security forces, and the research it had been purchased with was now doing the very thing that the research had been supposed to prevent. His response to this situation, pursuing Isaac across the station rather than accepting that the outbreak had already exceeded the capacity of Project Telomere's protocols to address, makes more sense when understood as the behavior of a man whose entire identity has been organized around a set of institutional commitments that the current reality is actively invalidating. Walking away from the marker, allowing its destruction, before EarthGov has extracted whatever practical application was supposed to follow from studying it, would require Tiedemann to conclude that everything he spent 3 years doing was not simply a failure, but an atrocity, without the mitigating compensation of eventual success. His pursuit of Isaac is, in part, a refusal to reach that conclusion. Isaac, moving through the commercial and transit sectors of the Sprawl toward Tiedemann's government sector, is doing what Isaac Clarke does, surviving, solving engineering problems, navigating the Necromorph infestation with the specific competence of someone who has done this before. He is not, at this point, fully conscious of the extent to which the site he is moving toward is also moving toward him, or of how completely the path he is following has been shaped by factors he cannot directly observe. His dementia is progressing as he moves. The Nicole hallucination is becoming more present, more specific, more structured in its appearances, and Strauss, who is navigating his own route through the station in parallel with Isaac's, is reaching the point where the gap between what he knows and what he can communicate is closing in the wrong direction, because the knowing is deteriorating faster than the communicating. The station around all of them is a city in the process of being erased. The scale of that erasure is worth making concrete. 1 million residents, reduced in the span of hours to a fraction of that number. The commercial areas Isaac moves through were ordinary places the previous morning. Shops, transit hubs, the everyday infrastructure of a large civilian population going about a normal day. They retain the traces of that normality. Posted schedules, advertisements for things nobody will ever purchase now, personal items abandoned in the speed of whatever ran from whatever, in ways that describe the interruption more precisely than any direct account of the violence itself. The Sprawl's architecture was designed for human convenience and density, not for the navigation of a biological crisis of this particular character. Wide corridors that allow necromorphs to flank from multiple angles simultaneously. Transit systems that connect every sector to every other sector. Something in this station was always going to fail. The architecture of the disaster was written into the architecture of the place the moment EarthGov decided to build the largest marker in human history inside a structure housing 1 million people and call it a controlled research environment. Isaac Clarke moves through what remains of it. The Nicole hallucination moves with him, appearing at intervals, whispering things that sound like guidance and occasionally like accusation. Strauss is somewhere ahead of him, Tiedemann is somewhere behind him, and buried in the government sector at the center of the station, the thing built from the information in Isaac's brain is doing what it was always built to do. The moment that reveals what Tiedemann's 3 years of management actually produced in terms of both the physical marker and the institutional damage done to everyone involved in building it is coming. And the revelation, when it arrives, says something about the limits of believing you can control something whose design you do not fully understand, that applies well beyond any game's specific events. Chapter 5. What He Carried. There is a scene partway through this story where Nolan Strauss holds a screwdriver and looks at Ellie Langford in a way that should read as warning. It does not read as warning in the moment, because the behavior leading up to it has been disorganized enough that it is difficult to distinguish where the genuinely alarming ends and the simple incoherence begins. The dementia that the marker's signal has been advancing through Strauss since his exposure on the Obannon does not deteriorate in a straight line. It moves in waves, producing moments of apparent lucidity between episodes of total perceptual collapse, and the lucid moments are dangerous in a specific way. They look, from the outside, enough like functional human communication that they keep generating the expectation that communication is still the primary mode of exchange happening. The screwdriver scene is not a sudden break from what Strauss has been. It is the visible arrival of a process that was always going to happen, given enough time and proximity to an active marker. Ellie loses an eye. Strauss loses whatever thread was keeping him connected to the alliance he had formed with Isaac, and whatever goal that alliance was meant to serve. Isaac is eventually forced to kill him. Before arriving at that ending, though, it is worth working through what Strauss was actually trying to communicate across this story's middle chapters, because buried inside the fragmentation and repetition and the references to his wife and son that keep resurfacing in whatever order his mind produces them was real information. The steps Strauss kept returning to were not psychotic non sequiturs. They were his deteriorating attempt to reconstruct a specific procedure that he had apparently learned from the sessions in the Noonlight diagnostics machine, and that he believed constituted the method for destroying the marker. His references to what he called the steps followed a pattern that makes more sense in retrospect than it does during the events themselves. Each step corresponded to a phase in the process that EarthGov had used to extract marker blueprints from their research subjects, apparently reversible in some fashion when run against an active marker rather than against a human brain holding the signal. The needle through the eye, the machine's access to the lateral geniculate nucleus, the unlocking of the blocked sections of the marker-touched mind, all of these had a destructive counterpart that could, in theory, be turned against the artifact that had generated the signal, rather than against the organic hosts that were carrying it. Strauss knew this because his mind had more of the process cataloged than Isaac's, not because he was more intelligent or more attuned to the marker's signal, but because he had been processed through the Noonlight diagnostics machine a greater number of times and apparently retained more of the procedural memory associated with each session despite the suppressants. The suppressants were supposed to erase the explicit memory of each session from the accessible mind. In Strauss's case, they appear to have been less effective at suppressing the procedural dimensions of what he experienced, which may explain the very specific and repeated references to particular steps, despite his inability to produce a coherent narrative account of what those steps actually were. This is worth examining through what research on traumatic memory actually describes, because the way Strauss's knowledge was stored and the way it expressed itself under dementia follows a recognizable clinical pattern. Human memory is not a single system. Explicit memory, the conscious, narrative, declarable kind, the ability to say when, where, and what happened in organized sequence, is the most fragile form of memory under the influence of both trauma and pharmacological suppression. Implicit and procedural memory, the kind that stores how to do things rather than what happened when you did them, is considerably more resistant to disruption. A person can lose years of explicit autobiographical memory to injury or pharmaceutical intervention and retain muscle memory, emotional associations, and procedural knowledge that was laid down during the same period the explicit memories came from. Strauss's steps survived in the form they did because they were stored at least partially as procedural knowledge rather than as explicit narrative. He could not tell Isaac a clear story about what the Noonlight diagnostics machine had done, or what he had experienced inside it. What he could access were fragments of the procedure itself, stored in the way that actions and sequences are stored, which is why they kept surfacing in the wrong order, stripped of the contextual scaffolding that would have made them immediately interpretable, but nonetheless persistent. His wife and son surfaced in the same sessions because his emotional memory associated the machine with the period immediately following their deaths, the period when he was being processed as patient 5, and the emotional memory was even less suppressible than the procedural kind. This creates a specific form of tragedy around Strauss that is easy to miss when his behavior is read purely as deterioration. He was not simply a broken man producing random noise. He was a man whose relevant knowledge was stored in a form that his damaged, explicit recall system could not retrieve cleanly, whose every attempt to communicate that knowledge was filtered through the emotional catastrophe that the machine's sessions had become entangled with in his memory's associative architecture. His references to his wife were not distractions from the information. They were the route by which the information lived in his brain, inseparable from the worst thing he had ever done, and accessible only through that wound. Isaac's forced killing of Strauss arrives after the attack on Ellie, and a period in which Strauss's behavior has moved beyond what any alliance can accommodate. The moment deserves slow attention not for its violence, but for what it represents about Isaac's situation at that point in the story. He has now killed the one other person in the Sprawl who shared his specific history with the marker, who had been through the same research program, who knew from direct experience what the Noonlight diagnostics machine had taken and what the signal was trying to do with its subjects. The information Strauss carried is now inaccessible. Whatever procedural knowledge lived in Strauss's damaged recall system went with him. What Isaac has left, after Strauss is gone and Ellie has been sent ahead, and the path to the government sector narrows to a single direction, is the part of the procedure he managed to extract from Strauss's fragmentary communications, incomplete but sufficient, and his own marker-encoded mind, which has been building toward something he still does not fully understand. Strauss functions in this story's structure the way certain character archetypes function across many different kinds of narrative, and the comparison is worth making explicitly rather than leaving as an implied pattern. He is the figure who demonstrates what the protagonist could become if the protagonist's story went differently, a dark version of the road ahead, made briefly visible before it closes off. In John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, Candy's dog shows Candy what is coming for him. In Cormac McCarthy's The Road, the state of other survivors shows the father what he is trying to prevent his son from becoming. In the video game BioShock, the fate of Sander Cohen's disciples demonstrates what complete submission to an artist's deranged vision produces in the human beings who serve it. The pattern is ancient, and it serves a specific narrative function that is also a psychological function. Watching someone else's arc reach its conclusion, particularly someone whose starting conditions closely resembled your own, generates a category of urgency that abstract warning cannot produce. Isaac watching Strauss deteriorate is not simply watching an unfortunate man's misfortune. It is watching a demonstration of what the marker's influence looks like when it is allowed to proceed without successful resistance, in a mind that was exposed to the same signal through nearly the same mechanisms. The demonstration is not neutral information. It is the story's way of making the stakes of Isaac's own psychological battle experientially concrete rather than abstractly logical. What makes this more complicated than a simple cautionary tale structure is that Strauss's fate is not fully separable from Isaac's choices. Every hour that the Alliance continues and Strauss is not yet at the point of violence is an hour in which Isaac has the option to extract more of what Strauss knows, to try harder to parse the fragmented communications into actionable procedure. The story does not frame this as Isaac failing Strauss by not trying harder. The deterioration was going to happen regardless, but the Alliance's failure, when it comes, leaves Isaac with the information he has and no more, which shapes what he is able to do with the Noonlight diagnostics machine when he finally reaches it. Strauss's ending is not simply a tragedy for Strauss, it is a constraint on what Isaac can accomplish, and therefore a structural element of the story's final act. Ellie, after losing her eye and recovering from the attack, remains in the story as the figure who has not been compromised by either the marker's signal or the 3 years of Project Telomere's extraction sessions. Her continued functioning at a high level of practical competence, her ability to make operational decisions uncontaminated by the signal that is increasingly shaping everything Isaac perceives, is what eventually makes Isaac's escape possible rather than purely self-sacrificial. She is the part of the system that the marker's signal has not yet found a way to colonize. The moment Strauss attacks Ellie is also the moment this story crosses a threshold that it has been approaching since its opening. Up to that point, the primary threat to the characters from other characters has been institutional rather than personal. EarthGov is hunting Isaac as a resource. Unitology wanted to acquire him for equivalent purposes. Tiedemann is deploying security forces as an administrator, protecting a research program. All of these are institutional forms of harm, mediated through systems and hierarchies and chains of command. Strauss attacking Ellie is personal, immediate, and committed by someone who was briefly an ally, who has genuine knowledge of what everyone is dealing with, and whose violence is not the product of institutional decisions, but of a mind that has reached the limit of what it can hold together. This shift matters. It makes the threat inside the Alliance visible at exactly the moment when the Alliance has advanced far enough that losing it costs something real. And it reminds the story's audience of something that was easy to forget while the Necromorph outbreak was providing continuous external pressure. The most intimate form of danger in this story is not the creatures in the corridors. It is what the marker does to the people who have been close to it. That observation opens into the dimension of Dead Space 2 that most distinguishes it from its predecessor, and that makes it, in certain respects, a harder story to sit with, despite its more expansive setting. Dead Space 1's primary horror was external. The Ishimura was full of things that wanted to kill Isaac, and his survival depended on navigating the physical environment more effectively than the creatures did. Dead Space 2 contains that same horror, but adds a form of threat that the first game only gestured at in its final reveal. The Site-12 marker is not just generating necromorphs from the biomass of the Sprawl's former population. It has been working on Isaac's mind, through the Nicole hallucination, in ways that are specifically calibrated to his individual psychology. And that calibration, when it finally becomes fully visible in the story's last act, reveals something about grief as a mechanism that is worth examining carefully before following Isaac into the government sector. The Nicole hallucination in Dead Space 2 is not the same as the Nicole hallucination in the first game. In Dead Space 1, the hallucinations of Nicole function primarily as the marker's method of steering Isaac toward specific locations and objectives on the Ishimura, presenting themselves as a version of the real Nicole that was still alive and reachable. The audience learned, before Isaac did, that Nicole had taken her own life at the onset of the Ishimura outbreak, and the hallucination was therefore retrospectively readable as a deliberate misdirection, using Isaac's hope that she might still be alive as the hook that kept him moving through the ship. By Dead Space 2, Isaac has processed the truth about Nicole's death at some level. The hallucination he encounters on the Sprawl is not pretending to be a Nicole who might still be alive. It knows he knows. Its behavior across the game shifts between two modes, hostility and guidance, and the shift between them tracks the marker's evolving assessment of what Isaac is most likely to do next, and what approach is most likely to produce the outcome the marker requires. The hostile Nicole appears when the marker's most immediate need is to destabilize Isaac, to prevent him from operating clearly, to generate enough psychological disruption that he cannot efficiently pursue the goal of reaching the marker and destroying it. She attacks him in ways that use his guilt as the weapon. She confronts him with his responsibility for her being on the Ishimura in the first place, for the persuasion that sent her to a posting she would not have taken without his encouragement, for the argument that preceded their last communication. The attacks are not arbitrary. They are precisely targeted at the specific guilt structure that Isaac has been carrying since before the events of the first game. The guiding Nicole appears when the marker's most immediate need is to move Isaac closer to the marker's location, to the Noonlight diagnostics machine, to the actions that will serve the convergence event that the marker has been working toward since its construction was complete. In those moments, she adopts the tone and quality of the Nicole that Isaac remembers caring about, helpful and warm, oriented toward his survival, presenting the next step as something that will help him rather than harm him. A grief-shaped hallucination that can shift between punishment and comfort based on what the hallucinating mind is most responsive to in a given moment is, as a psychological architecture, a very specific kind of manipulation, and the specificity of it draws on something that has been documented about grief and guilt in the real world. Research on complicated grief, the form of bereavement that develops when loss is entangled with unresolved conflict, guilt, or circumstances the griever cannot fully integrate, consistently finds that it operates differently from ordinary grief in ways that make it more vulnerable to external exploitation. Ordinary grief, if such a thing can be said to exist, tends to diminish over time as the mind integrates the loss into its ongoing narrative about the self and the world. Complicated grief, characterized by intense intrusive thoughts about the deceased, a persistent sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders, and a difficulty envisioning a future that the deceased is not part of, does not follow this trajectory. It loops, it resurfaces, it maintains a relationship with the deceased that is simultaneously too present and too unresolved to allow the ordinary integration process to complete. Isaac's grief for Nicole has every characteristic of complicated grief in the clinical sense. His guilt about persuading her to take the Ishimura posting, the unresolved argument that preceded their last communication, the fact that she was gone before he could reach her, the impossibility of the closure that their final conversation might have allowed. These are precisely the conditions that complicated grief research describes as most likely to produce persistent, intrusive experience of the deceased. The marker's hallucination of Nicole is not invented out of nothing. It is built from the exact psychological material that Isaac's unresolved grief has been generating and regenerating for years, given form and direction, and an agenda that has nothing to do with Isaac's well-being. In literature and in other games, the figure who wears the face of a dead loved one to manipulate a protagonist through their grief has appeared in several specific forms worth comparing. James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2 is the most direct parallel in horror gaming. James enters the town of Silent Hill following a letter from his wife Mary, who had died before the game's events. The letter, which James believes is real, turns out to be something that Silent Hill's psychological landscape has generated from his own guilt and denial, a manifestation of the parts of his mind he cannot directly access working themselves toward a confrontation he has been avoiding. Mary appears throughout the game in forms that track James's own psychological state, most notably in the figure of Maria, a woman who looks like Mary and behaves as James needs Mary to have behaved, accommodating and present in ways that the real Mary could not have been in the final months of her illness. The parallel with Isaac's Nicole hallucination is not coincidental in the structural sense, even if the two games arrived at similar territory through different creative paths. Both are stories about men haunted by the dead women they loved, in supernatural environments that use that haunting as the primary mechanism for psychological navigation. Both stories ultimately require the protagonist to confront the hallucination and, in doing so, confront the version of themselves that the grief has been protecting from examination. Both resolve not through the protagonist accepting that the woman is gone, which both men knew intellectually before the story began, but through the protagonist confronting something specific about their own role in the events surrounding her death that the grief has been organized around avoiding. The difference is in the external source of the manipulation. James's confrontation with Mary is manufactured by Silent Hill's own psychological landscape, generated from his own suppressed guilt with no agenda beyond surfacing what he cannot face. Isaac's confrontation with Nicole is manufactured by the Site 12 marker, which has a specific operational agenda extending well beyond Isaac's psychological healing, and which uses his grief not to push him toward resolution, but to steer him toward convergence. The grief is real in both cases. The figure wearing the face of the dead is not neutral in either case, but the marker's Nicole is working toward something that has nothing to do with what Isaac needs, and everything to do with what the marker was designed to accomplish. This is the point at which the Nicole hallucination's shifting behavior across the game becomes legible in a different way. When it is hostile, it is working to prevent Isaac from moving toward the marker's destruction before the convergence event can be completed. When it is guiding, it is working to move Isaac toward the Noonlight Diagnostics machine, the device that will unlock the blocked marker-affected portions of his mind, which the marker needs him to access for the convergence to proceed. The apparent kindness of the guiding Nicole is not kindness. It is operationally useful behavior from a system that has assessed Isaac's psychological state and determined that presenting as helpful will produce the behavioral response the marker needs from him at that specific moment. What makes this disturbing in a way that is different from conventional horror is the overlay it creates on everything Isaac is experiencing that feels like love and grief. Those feelings are real, they are his. The marker did not manufacture them. It found them already present, already shaping his behavior, already creating the precise kind of vulnerability that its hallucination could install itself into. The grief that makes Isaac susceptible to the Nicole hallucination was always going to be there regardless of whether any marker ever touched his mind. The marker's influence is not the source of the wound. It is the instrument that was threaded through the wound once the wound was found. If you have made it this far into the story, hold that distinction carefully through the next section, because what Isaac encounters in the government sector when he finally reaches the marker and the machine that built it and the hallucination shifts into its final configuration requires understanding the difference between what the marker manufactured and what was Isaac's all along. That difference is what the ending of this story is actually about, and arriving at it without having followed the logic that built toward it would leave the ending feeling smaller than it is. The approach to the government sector is also the approach to Tiedemann's final position in this story, and Tiedemann's ending reveals something about what 3 years of Project Telomere did to him that his own logs do not fully capture. Chapter 6: Nicole's Architecture. The government sector of Titan Station is built differently from everything above it. The public areas of the Sprawl, the commercial districts, the transit systems, the residential blocks were designed for human convenience, for density and flow, and the comfortable management of large numbers of people moving through shared space. The government sector was designed for control. Its corridors are narrower in specific ways, its architecture organized around choke points and security checkpoints, and the management of movement as something to be regulated rather than facilitated. It is a space designed by people who expected that what happened inside it would need to be carefully separated from what happened outside it, and whose entire professional experience had trained them to treat that separation as the most important variable in any situation. Isaac reaches the sector's outer perimeter through a sequence that requires him to breach it from below, using a drilling machine to punch through the facility's lower barrier from the Titan mine's side. He brings Necromorphs in with him. This is not an accident. The EarthGov security forces holding the outer perimeter represent a genuine obstacle to his access, and the Necromorphs represent the only force sufficient to overwhelm them rapidly enough to create a path. Isaac uses the outbreak as a tool against the institution that caused it, turning Tiedemann's catastrophic failure into the instrument of Tiedemann's defeat. The Ubermorph appears in the government sector for the first time shortly after Isaac's breach, and it is worth describing this creature in some detail because it functions in the story as more than a gameplay obstacle. Among the Necromorph variants that the Site-12 marker has generated from the Sprawl's biomass, the Ubermorph is notable for two specific characteristics: its physical appearance, which is more markedly alien than the human-derived shapes of most standard necromorphs, suggesting a more complete transformation away from the human biological template it originated from, and its ability to regenerate lost limbs at a speed that makes conventional combat attrition ineffective against it. The Hunter in Dead Space 1 had the same regenerative capacity, but the Hunter was a deliberate creation, the product of Chalice Mercer's experiments designed to produce a specific research outcome. The Ubermorph appears to have developed its characteristics through a different process, one that is less about deliberate design and more about the marker's influence on an existing organism reaching a further stage of expression. It tracks Isaac through the government sector with a persistence that is qualitatively different from the more reactive behavior of standard necromorphs, appearing to exercise something closer to decision-making about routes and timing, moving toward Isaac rather than simply responding to his presence as a stimulus. The Ubermorph is also apparently responding to the marker's signal in a more direct way than other necromorphs. When Isaac cuts power to a section of the facility to release the door holding back the wider necromorph horde, the Ubermorph can be seen entering the government sector alongside the advancing creatures, apparently directing or at minimum coordinating its movement with theirs, in a way that positions it as a vanguard element of the marker's final push toward convergence. The creature is not pursuing Isaac out of the hunting behavior that drives standard variants. It is pursuing him because, from the marker's perspective, Isaac, in a state that cannot be destroyed quietly by conventional necromorph contact, is the last obstacle between the current situation and the convergence event's completion. The marker's approach to Isaac throughout this story has followed a hierarchy of methods, each one deployed in sequence as the previous one proves insufficient. The necromorphs in the public sectors of the Sprawl were not specifically targeting Isaac. He was simply present in the outbreak environment and subject to the same threats as anyone else. Tiedemann's security forces were deployed with orders to capture or eliminate Isaac as a specific individual, which represents a more targeted institutional response. The Ubermorph represents a step beyond either of these, a marker-generated organism whose behavior suggests direct operational direction from the marker itself, pursuing a specific individual with a precision that the standard outbreak dynamic cannot account for. And then there is the Nicole hallucination, which has been operating at the highest level of specificity throughout. The shift in Nicole's presentation as Isaac moves through the government sector and closer to the marker's chamber is gradual enough that it could be missed in the pace of navigating the environment, and worth slowing down to examine carefully. The hostile Nicole that has been appearing throughout the middle sections of the story, attacking Isaac, confronting him with guilt, attempting to generate enough psychological disruption to prevent him from operating effectively, begins to recede. In its place, a version of the hallucination that presents as guiding and peaceful starts to become dominant. She points toward the Noonlight diagnostics machine. She suggests that using it will help him. She presents the machine's procedure as the next step in something that will work out in Isaac's favor. This shift corresponds precisely to the marker's operational assessment of Isaac's position. He has already killed Tiedemann's security forces, breached the government sector, released the Necromorph horde into the facility. He is going to reach the marker. The hostile Nicole was deployed when preventing him from reaching the marker was still a viable goal. The guiding Nicole is deployed once that goal is no longer achievable, and the marker's priority has shifted to ensuring that when Isaac reaches the marker, he does so in a psychological state that makes him useful to the convergence rather than dangerous to it. The marker needs Isaac to use the Noonlight diagnostics machine. The machine's function, run against a mind carrying the marker's imprinted blueprints in proximity to the physical marker, unlocks the blocked portions of the marker-affected neural architecture. In practical terms, this means opening the sections of Isaac's brain where the signal has been stored and suppressed by 3 years of medication, allowing the full pattern of the marker's embedded agenda to become accessible. The marker frames this, through Nicole, as something Isaac needs to do to understand how to destroy it. The full picture of what accessing that information actually does in terms of the convergence process is not something the hallucination explains clearly. Isaac uses the machine, the sections of his mind that the suppressants had been blocking open, and in the moment that they open, Isaac sees the Site 12 marker clearly for the first time, understands its scale, recognizes that this object was built from the contents of his own mind, and hears Nicole telling him that the necromorphs surrounding the marker are coming to it. That convergence is beginning. The moment Isaac looks at the marker and understands that he built it is one of the more precisely horrible sequences in this entire franchise's history, and it works because it transforms the nature of the horror Isaac has been navigating. Everything on the Ishimura was done to him by external forces he had no prior relationship to. The Site 12 marker was built from information that lives inside his own brain. The disaster consuming the Sprawl is not incidentally connected to Isaac Clarke. It is his, in a specific technical sense, the product of his mind's contents expressed in physical form by an institution that treated his mind as raw material. He is not a survivor of the marker's creation. He is its most intimate source. This revelation is what the hostile Nicole had been trying to prevent him from reaching, because a man who understands the nature of his relationship to the marker is considerably harder to manipulate toward convergence than a man still operating with partial information, and it is what the guiding Nicole had been steering him toward, because the full unlocking of the marker-affected neural sections is also the condition necessary for the convergence's final stage. The contradiction resolves when the story's final confrontation makes the marker's actual intention explicit. What the marker wants from Isaac is not simply his proximity or his actions. It wants his death at the right moment in the right location, because the convergence requires the biomass of the people who built it and those connected to it. The makers must be absorbed. This is what Nicole was always moving toward, through both her hostile and guiding manifestations. The hostility was designed to destabilize him. The guidance was designed to position him. Both were working toward the same outcome. There is something in this architecture that illuminates the broader pattern of how the markers interact with human psychology throughout the Dead Space universe. The signal does not simply generate random psychological disruption. It targets specifically. It finds the structure of the mind it is working with and builds its intervention around the exact emotional and cognitive material that is most likely to produce the behavioral response the marker requires from that individual. For most people, this means accelerating toward violence, toward self-destruction, toward the accumulation of necromorph biomass near the marker's location. For Isaac, who is more resistant to the signal's standard pathways, it means something more sophisticated, a sustained, years-long manipulation that used his grief and his guilt and his love for Nicole as the operating environment for an agenda he never consented to. The grief was real. The love was real. The guilt was real. None of that was manufactured. The marker found it, read it, and built an interface from it that looked enough like something Isaac recognized to function as a guide through his own psychology. And the guide led toward the marker's benefit rather than his own. This is where the comparison to Jason Bourne becomes specific rather than merely illustrative. Bourne, across Robert Ludlum's series and the films derived from it, is a man whose skills were installed through a program he entered voluntarily, but whose parameters he did not fully understand, and who subsequently spent years trying to reclaim authorship of a self that had been partially built by an intelligence program for the program's own operational purposes. The horror of Bourne's situation is not the violence. It is the question of which parts of himself he can trust as genuinely his, and which were installed by Treadstone. He cannot always tell from the inside. His body does things he did not consciously decide to do. His mind has knowledge he cannot account for the origin of. Isaac's version of this is more extreme in certain dimensions. The skills are his own. The knowledge installed by the marker was placed there without even the attenuated consent that Bourne's voluntary enrollment represented. And the interface built from his grief for Nicole is more intimate than anything a spy program was ever positioned to construct, because it uses the most personal, emotional material Isaac carries, rather than building on abstract training protocols. What he discovers at the marker is not that he has been made into a weapon. He has been made into a construction material, and the construction is complete, and the marker has been waiting for the final ingredient. The final ingredient is him. Tiedemann, burned by the marker's energy discharge in the moments before Isaac reaches the chamber, presents the story's most direct image of what it looks like when an institution's relationship to the marker finally consumes the person running the institution. The energy pulse that the marker releases as the convergence process advances burns Tiedemann down the right side of his body to the point of exposed tissue, and the burns take on a pattern that is not incidental. The marker's symbols appear scored directly into his flesh, including on his forehead. The man who spent 3 years managing the marker's construction is now wearing the marker's symbols on his own body, whether he wanted to or not. His final communication with Isaac before their last confrontation describes someone who has not fully departed from the belief structure that has been organizing his decision-making throughout the story. He continues to defend the research. He continues to frame the situation as something that was close to working before it went wrong. He frames the convergence event currently consuming the chamber around him as an unanticipated failure mode, rather than the precise outcome the marker was always designed to produce. The burns and the symbols and the station collapsing around him have not produced what a simpler narrative would require, a man recognizing the full scope of what he did wrong. Instead, what Tiedemann offers in his final moments is something more honest and therefore more uncomfortable than villainous clarity. He is a man who genuinely believed he was saving the world, who pursued that belief through methods that harmed everyone they touched, who never fully developed the capacity to evaluate his own program from outside its own justification structure, and who is now experiencing the consequences of that failure in the most direct physical terms available, while still not fully processing what those consequences mean about the decisions he made. The psychological term for this specific configuration is motivated reasoning taken to its structural limit. When the mind has been building its self-conception around a particular belief for long enough that the belief and the self are no longer separable, disconfirming evidence stops being disconfirming and starts being absorbed into the belief as a complication rather than a refutation. Tiedemann's belief that EarthGov was close to controlling the marker's power advanced in the middle of a convergence event in a chamber full of necromorphs, while the marker's symbols burn themselves into his own skin, is not evidence of stupidity or cruelty. It is evidence of how completely a person can organize their cognition around a sufficiently central conviction. Isaac kills Tiedemann, not as retribution, and not as anything that resolves the larger question of institutional accountability for what Project Telomere produced. He kills him because Tiedemann is standing between him and what comes next. The larger accounting, the institutional one, the question of what EarthGov owes the people of the Sprawl and the research subjects of Project Telomere and the families of everyone the Site-12 marker consumed, that accounting does not happen in this story. It cannot happen inside a single individual's act of survival, however consequential that act turns out to be. Isaac Clarke approaches the marker. The Nicole hallucination pulls him into his own mind. And what happens inside that mind is the part of this story that the entire preceding structure was built to make comprehensible. Chapter 7. The Mind Inside the Mind. There is a specific moment near the end of Dead Space 2 where Isaac Clarke stands in front of the largest marker in human history, surrounded by the biomass of what was recently a city, and the hallucination of the woman he loved shifts character one final time. The surrounding necromorphs do not attack him. The convergence process has been building around the marker's structure, pulling everything close to it inward, and in that gathering energy, the creatures seem to recognize something about Isaac that the marker's signal is communicating to them directly. He is not prey. He is the last ingredient. The Nicole hallucination reaches out from the signal architecture that has been accumulating around Isaac's imprinted mind since the first hours of the outbreak, and pulls him somewhere that is neither the Sprawl nor any physical location. It pulls him into his own mind. The space inside is worth describing because its visual grammar is precise and not accidental. Isaac's mental landscape in this sequence is organized around the marker's signal and around the sections of his brain that the Noonlight diagnostics machine unlocked, rendered as physical architecture in the way that certain psychological experiences have to be rendered physically to be navigable. It is dark in the specific way that memory rendered under pressure is dark, not totally absent of detail, but stripped of the stabilizing context that makes ordinary spaces feel continuous. Portions of the marker's structure appear throughout it, glowing with the same orange luminescence that the hallucination of Nicole's eyes produce at their most intense. Isaac is inside the thing that was built from his mind, and the thing is simultaneously inside him, and the distinction between these two facts has collapsed at this particular juncture, in a way that the story has been building towards since its opening moments. The Nicole entity's final reveal here, the declaration that the makers must be consumed, and that this absorption is the last requirement of the convergence process, is the moment this story's entire structure of manipulation becomes completely legible. Everything Nicole said, in her hostile manifestations and her guiding ones, was oriented toward this point. Every attack designed to destabilize Isaac, every moment of apparent warmth designed to keep him moving in the right direction, every piece of information offered and every piece withheld, all of it was the preparation work for this specific request. The marker wants Isaac dead, in this location at this moment, so that his body and the information encoded in his mind can be incorporated into the convergence event as its completion element. The makers must be consumed. The person who built the marker must be consumed by it. This is not a metaphor that the signal is producing. It is the operational requirement for the final stage of the convergence, and it explains why the marker kept Isaac alive and maintained in proximity, rather than simply driving him toward a standard dementia-induced death the way it did with most of the other people it touched. Standard dementia progression produces dead biomass at no particular location and no particular time, useful for generating necromorphs, but not for the specific final assembly a convergence event requires. Isaac was being conserved, suppressed, managed, guided, and moved because he was needed in this exact configuration at this exact location at this exact moment. 3 years of Project Sprawl, the extraction sessions, the memory suppressants, the slow release into the outbreak rather than a simple termination of the research program. All of it was the marker's timeline expressed through EarthGov's institutional framework. Whether Tiedemann understood that or not, EarthGov believed it was using the marker's information for its own purposes. The more uncomfortable reading of the evidence is that the marker was using EarthGov's research program to position its primary construction material where it needed to be. This is one of the few moments in the Dead Space universe where the marker's design becomes legible not as random alien menace but as something with operational coherence. The markers do not simply generate necromorphs from surrounding biomass and hope for the best. They manage the people whose minds they have touched toward specific outcomes over long time frames, using whatever institutional or psychological infrastructure is already present in the environment. EarthGov provided the institutional infrastructure. Isaac's grief provided the psychological one. The marker used both with the same instrumental precision, neither the corporation nor the grief mattering in themselves except as mechanisms for producing the positioning it required. Isaac fights the Nicole entity inside his own mind. The battle, as it is rendered in the game, is Isaac working through the marker-infected sections of his own psyche, dismantling the signal's architecture from the inside, destroying the aspects of Nicole's hallucination that the marker constructed from his own emotional material. This is a different category of combat from everything else this story has offered. The necromorphs in the corridors were external threats. Tiedemann was an institutional opponent. Strauss was an ally who became an immediate danger. The Nicole entity is assembled from Isaac's own grief, guilt, and love, and dismantling it requires him to engage directly with those things rather than deflecting them or surviving them at a distance. The psychological reality of what this sequence is representing, even within the game's sci-fi framework, maps onto something that grief research has documented as genuinely one of the most difficult stages of complicated bereavement, the moment when the bereaved person stops managing the grief from a distance and instead has to sit inside the full shape of what was lost, examining not just the loss itself, but their own role in the circumstances surrounding it, without the protection of denial, distance, or any remaining useful pretense that the situation might have been different. Isaac cannot survive this confrontation by running away from what the Nicole entity represents. Every previous engagement with the hallucination in this story has been either evasion or endurance. He could not actually address the grief directly, because the marker's signal had constructed the hallucination specifically to prevent that kind of engagement, weaponizing the grief while keeping it perpetually unresolved, because a resolved grief is no longer useful as a manipulation tool. The confrontation inside his own mind is the first moment in this entire story, where Isaac has the opportunity to do something other than survive what the Nicole hallucination does to him. He destroys it. Not Nicole, who was already gone long before this story began. What he destroys is the specific construction the marker built from his grief. The version of Nicole that was simultaneously his wound and the marker's interface, stripped of whatever remained of the real person and reduced to a mechanism. The destruction of this construction is also the destruction of the marker's primary hold on Isaac's mind. The creative director of Dead Space 2, Wright Bagwell, described the Nicole hallucination as a mixture of Isaac's guilt and fear combined with the marker's direct influence, one element being the signal's operational output and the other being genuinely Isaac's own psychological material. Both elements were real. Both were present throughout. The destruction of the Nicole entity in Isaac's mind is therefore not the destruction of everything he felt for the real Nicole. It is the destruction of the form that those feelings had been pressed into by the marker's signal, the exploitation of the feelings rather than the feelings themselves. This distinction is what makes the moment possible without being simply a story about a man destroying his grief. Isaac is not destroying his love for Nicole, or his guilt about his role in her death, or the genuine, unresolvable loss of someone he would have spent his life with. He is destroying the marker's version of those things, which had been shaped into a tool for purposes that had nothing to do with him. What remains after the destruction is not the absence of grief. It is the grief itself, without the marker's architecture around it, which is smaller and more bearable, and, crucially, his alone. The marker collapses when the entity inside Isaac's mind is defeated. The physical destruction of the Site-12 marker is not the result of an engineering solution, or a weapons discharge, or any of the conventional mechanisms by which large structures in this universe have been brought down. It is the result of Isaac successfully navigating the interior of his own mind and removing the marker's last point of access to him. The marker cannot complete the convergence without its final ingredient intact. Without that ingredient, the assembled system fails, and the failure propagates outward through the physical structure of the marker itself, in a chain of collapse that takes the surrounding sprawl with it. Isaac falls, the station around him is destroying itself. He sent Ellie away before entering the government sector, sending her ahead on a gunship, rather than bringing her into a space he was not certain anyone else could survive. She left, furious about his apparent resignation to a death she could not prevent if she stayed. The expectation he constructed for both of them was that his survival beyond this point was not something to plan around. The gunship comes through the ceiling. Ellie, who was sent away, who did not agree with the decision to send her away, who exercised the specific form of operational independence that has characterized her throughout this story, returns. She crashes through the ceiling of the collapsing facility in the ship she was supposed to escape in, because the evaluation she made of the situation produced a different calculation than the one Isaac made when he sent her ahead. He had calculated that bringing her into the government sector was too dangerous to justify. She calculated that leaving him in a collapsing government sector was too dangerous to justify. Her calculation involved her own body and her own ship as the mechanism of the solution, which is consistent with every prior decision she has made in this story. Isaac makes it to the gunship. The station collapses behind them as they clear the facility. Titan Station, the Sprawl, the 1 million person civilization built on the fragment of a cracked moon, is destroyed in the sequence of failures that the Site-12 marker's convergence event initiated and the marker's own destruction completed. What was, the previous morning, a functioning city ceases to exist as a functional structure. The two survivors in the escaping gunship are an engineer who was held prisoner and experimented on without his knowledge for 3 years, and a heavy equipment pilot who went to her job and found the world ending when she got there. Neither of them is the same person who began this story. Isaac, most obviously, has spent hours navigating an outbreak while recovering memories of 3 missing years and confronting the thing built from the contents of his own mind. Ellie has lost an eye and most of the people she was working with, and, more quietly, most of whatever remained of the expectation that institutions and environments she was embedded in could be trusted to remain stable. The escape is not a victory in the conventional sense of that word. The Sprawl is gone. The 1 million people who lived there are gone. The only direct institutional perpetrators who faced direct consequences were Tiedemann, who died in ways connected to his own choices, and neither of whom was the highest level of the institutional hierarchy responsible for what Project Telomere produced. The research subjects who did not survive the program left no acknowledged record. The researchers who were gradually compromised by the marker's signal through their study of Isaac's neural data left detailed audio logs in a facility that no longer exists. Isaac survived. The marker he was used to build was destroyed. The dementia that 3 years of extraction sessions had been advancing in his brain is apparently, from the evidence of the story's closing moments, significantly reduced by his destruction of the marker's hold on his mind, though the long-term prognosis for his cognitive state is not something this story resolves. He and Ellie escape together into the space around Saturn, carrying between them the accumulated damage of everything that happened since the morning the alarms went off in the medical sector. There is one more thing this story does before it closes, and it happens after the credits. An audio transmission between an unnamed subordinate and a ranking official identified in the station's recovered text logs, as the overseer confirms that Titan Station, designated Marker Site 12 in EarthGov's classification system, has been destroyed along with its marker. The response from the superior is measured and operational. The other sites, the Overseer tells the subordinate, will have to pick up the pieces. Other sites. This is the sentence worth pausing on before closing out the story's events. Because the phrase is not an expression of frustration or loss, it is a logistical reassessment. Site 12 has been eliminated. The program continues. Whatever project Telomere was working toward, whatever application of marker technology EarthGov believed was within reach before the Site 12 catastrophe, is still being pursued at facilities that survived the Sprawl's destruction. The institution did not die with Tiedemann and the marker he built. It assessed the situation, absorbed the information about what went wrong, and recalibrated. The Overseer is not identified further in Dead Space 2's story. The transmission is the only direct evidence of the individual's existence in the game's events. What the transmission establishes is the existence of a command structure above Tiedemann, a level of institutional authority that was monitoring Project Telomere's progress and that responds to the Site 12 disaster not with alarm, but with continuity planning. This is the behavior of an institution that has already factored catastrophic local failure into its operational model. Tiedemann was the project director on Site 12. The Overseer was the command structure that Tiedemann reported to. The command structure's continued operational orientation after the destruction of the Sprawl tells you something precise about how the institution was designed to function, and about how resistant to failure by any individual component it was built to be. Understanding this is necessary for understanding why the ending of Dead Space 2 is not a resolution of the story's central conflict, even as it resolves the immediate situation Isaac found himself in. The immediate situation, the Site 12 marker, the outbreak on the Sprawl, Tiedemann's research program, is concluded. The structural conflict, humanity's institutions in self-perpetuating cycles of marker engagement that the institutions treat as necessity and the markers treat as operational behavior, persists. Isaac and Ellie escape into a universe where the Overseer is already redirecting resources where other sites exist in conditions that are less fully developed than Site 12, but progressing on the same trajectory, and where the institutional logic that produced Project Telomere has not been meaningfully disturbed by anything that happened on Titan Station. The other sites will have to pick up the pieces. This sentence functions as both a practical instruction and an honest description of how systems behave when a component fails. The pieces are not simply the debris of the Sprawl. The pieces are the project, the knowledge accumulated across 3 years of extraction sessions, the institutional investment in a specific approach to the marker problem, the belief that has been organizing EarthGov's resource allocation at the highest levels for decades. A system that has spent that much on a direction does not simply abandon it because one installation was destroyed. It recovers what can be recovered, learns from the failure, and continues. Real-world examples of this institutional pattern are more common than they should be. After the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in January of 1986, the investigation revealed that NASA engineers had identified and formally raised concerns about the specific O-ring failure mechanism responsible for the disaster months before the flight. The concerns were not ignored because the people receiving them were uncaring or incompetent. They were processed through an institutional decision-making structure that had gradually normalized accepting certain risk thresholds as acceptable, a process researchers studying institutional failure have called normalization of deviance, the incremental erosion of safety standards through repeated exposure to near misses and accepted risks that did not produce disasters, until the standard of acceptable risk has drifted so far from its original position that what would once have been an obvious danger has become institutionally routine. After Challenger, NASA underwent formal restructuring and review. After Columbia, 18 years later, a subsequent investigation found that the institutional culture had reconstituted many of the same normalization patterns that had contributed to Challenger because the structural pressures that produced those patterns had not been resolved by the organizational changes following the first disaster. The Overseer's transmission is the Dead Space universe's equivalent of that reconstitution happening in real time. The disaster is being absorbed as information about what went wrong at Site 12, which will inform how the program proceeds at other sites. The institutional learning is operational, not ethical. The question of whether the program should continue is not the question being asked. The question being asked is how to continue it more effectively. This is the dimension of this story that places it in a specific tradition of science fiction that uses institutional horror rather than creature horror as its primary register. The necromorphs are terrifying, but they are also legible. They want biomass near markers. They serve a comprehensible system. The institutions, EarthGov and Unitology, and the research program, and the command hierarchy above Tiedemann, want things that are also legible, but that are embedded in self-perpetuating justification structures, sophisticated enough to generate internal consensus that they are doing the right thing. The marker, at least, does not tell itself it is acting in humanity's interest. Chapter 8. The Overseer and the Long Pattern. What Isaac Clarke actually achieved on Titan Station, measured against the institutional scale of what he was fighting, requires some careful arithmetic. He destroyed the Site 12 marker. This prevented the convergence event from completing in the Sprawl's government sector, which prevented whatever outcome a completed convergence at that scale would have produced for the surrounding region of space, the details of which become clearer in subsequent Dead Space stories, and which are sufficiently catastrophic to treat the prevention as a genuine accomplishment. He survived, which was statistically improbable given the conditions he navigated. He got Ellie Langford out, which she was separately capable of managing herself, but which she chose to manage in a way that also included him. He destroyed 3 years' worth of the specific extraction records and session data that Project Telomere had accumulated at Site 12 simply by being in the facility when it collapsed. He did not dismantle the Overseer's command structure. He did not expose Project Telomere to the public. He did not create conditions under which the institutional pattern that produced the Site 12 marker became impossible to reproduce. He did not even know about the Overseer's existence, which means he had no capacity to address the continuity that the post-credits transmission describes. This kind of partial victory, enormous at the individual scale and modest at the institutional one, is a particular hallmark of stories that are honest about what individuals can actually accomplish against systems that have been designed with individual resistance factored into their architecture. Ellen Ripley, across the Alien franchise's first 2 films, destroyed the xenomorph presence on the Nostromo and then on the Hadley's Hope colony, at extraordinary personal cost in both cases. The company whose decisions created both disasters, Weyland-Yutani, was present and operational throughout both events, recovered whatever data it could from the wreckage of each, and continued pursuing xenomorph bioweapon research with the same institutional commitment to that goal that it had maintained before Ripley's interventions. Ripley's victories are genuine. The institution absorbs them as data points. The parallel is not that Isaac Clarke is Ripley, though the comparison of their situations as sole survivors of alien-contaminated environments navigating institutional betrayal has been made frequently enough to count as a recognized structural similarity. The parallel is in the story structure these two narratives share: individual agency against institutional persistence, with the individual capable of winning decisively at the local level and incapable of producing systemic change through the same actions. What makes Dead Space 2's handling of this pattern specific rather than simply conventional is the way it uses Isaac's position inside the institutional structure. Ripley is an outsider to Weyland-Yutani's worst decisions. She is a contractor who happened to be present when the company's agenda collided with the real consequences of pursuing it. Isaac is not an outsider. He is the primary material from which the institution built its most significant product. The marker that the Overseer's program will have to compensate for losing was built from Isaac Clarke's mind. His survival and the marker's destruction are therefore connected in a way that Ripley's survival and the xenomorph's destruction are not. Isaac's continued existence is itself the proof that the institution's approach was flawed, and that the thing they built from him was not actually under the control they believed they had. This creates an interesting question about what the Overseer's program does next, in terms of how it regards Isaac Clarke specifically, and that question becomes relevant in the events of the third Dead Space story. For the purposes of this story, what matters is that the Overseer's transmission, appearing after the credits, converts what might otherwise have felt like an ending into a deliberate indication that what just ended was one chapter of something considerably longer. The name Project Telomere deserves a slow look, because the choice of scientific terminology as a project name was not arbitrary. Telomeres are the protective caps at the end of chromosomes, the structures that prevent chromosomal deterioration during cell division and that shorten over time as cells replicate, eventually reaching a length insufficient to prevent damage, at which point the cell stops dividing. Telomere length has been studied extensively as a marker of biological aging. Shorter telomeres correlate with older biological age, with certain diseases, and with chronic stress, which has been shown to accelerate telomere shortening at a measurable rate. The study of telomeres is the study of what limits cellular lifespan and what might extend it. EarthGov named its marker research program after a structure associated with longevity and the mechanics of biological survival. The implication of the name, that the marker research was pursuing something related to the extended survival of humanity, rather than just the extraction of a new energy source, sits alongside Tiedemann's logs about the energy crisis in a way that suggests the project's goals were broader than the logs explicitly state. The marker's relationship to death and reanimation, the fact that their signal's primary output is the transformation of dead biological material into operational necromorphic forms, and unitology's theology of unity after death through marker contact. All of these point toward a set of institutional questions about mortality and biological continuity that the project name encodes without stating. This matters because it adds a dimension to Tiedemann's stated justification for the project that his logs do not fully articulate. He describes the energy crisis as the primary driver. The project name suggests that whoever designated it was thinking about something more fundamental, whether the markers hold information about the mechanics of biological life that could be applied to extend or alter the lifespan of the organisms in their vicinity, in ways that might address the resource crisis and something else simultaneously. This is a thread that the Dead Space universe's subsequent stories pull on in ways that are beyond the scope of this particular account. For now, it is worth holding as evidence that the institutional interest in the markers was never fully captured by the energy crisis framing that Tiedemann's logs offer as the primary explanation. Isaac Clarke leaves this story without the full picture of what the institutions arrayed around him have been pursuing. He knows what was done to him. He knows what was built from his mind. He knows that the marker is destroyed and that the Overseer's program is ongoing. What he does not know, what this story declines to fully deliver to him, is the answer to the question of why, in the deepest institutional sense, any of this was deemed worth doing. The energy crisis is a real answer. The telomere framing suggests it is not the complete one. That incompleteness is itself a feature of how institutional secrets actually work when they are distributed across multiple levels of a command hierarchy. Tiedemann knew everything about Project Telomere's local operations. He did not necessarily know everything about the program's ultimate goals, as understood by the Overseer's level of the hierarchy. The people who ran the extraction sessions knew the procedures. They may not have known the full context for what they were extracting, or why it was urgently needed. Isaac knows what was done to him across 3 years. He does not know everything about why. Real-world research on compartmentalized institutional programs consistently finds this pattern. The MK Ultra program's individual researchers often knew only their specific experimental domain, not the full architecture of what the program was attempting to build. The scientists working on components of nuclear weapons programs during the Second World War knew their specific technical contribution, but were deliberately kept ignorant of others. The compartmentalization is not accidental. It is a structural feature of programs that recognize the inherent tension between needing skilled, motivated contributors and minimizing the risk that any individual contributor develops enough of the full picture to generate effective opposition. Isaac, having survived and escaped, carries his portion of the picture. The Overseer carries the portion Isaac does not have access to. These two portions together would constitute something closer to a complete account. The story declines to make that account available, which is honest about how these situations actually work rather than tying itself into a resolution that real institutional secrets rarely produce. What Isaac has, moving away from the ruins of Titan Station in Ellie's gunship, is something more modest and, in a specific way, more important than the full picture. He has his own mind back, 3 years of extraction sessions, of memory suppression, of being used as a construction material for a project he never consented to, have not left him unable to function, or to make decisions, or to experience the world as something other than a delivery mechanism for the marker's signal. The dementia that was advancing through his neural architecture appears to have been disrupted by the destruction of the marker that was sustaining it. He is damaged, certainly. The psychological cost of everything he navigated across the events on the Sprawl is not something that simply resolves when the marker collapses, but he is capable of deciding what to do next. That capability, the simple ability to decide, was something EarthGov spent 3 years working to take from him, and the marker spent the entire game trying to replace with its own agenda. He got it back. The cost of getting it back was everything the Sprawl contained: 1 million people, 3 years of Project Telomere's research, Kinner Phelps and his team, Tiedemann, despite everything, whose institutional commitment to a genuinely felt sense of responsibility for humanity's survival does not make him innocent, and does not make him a monster, and does not resolve into anything clean. Ellie's eye. Strauss, who knew something real and could not get it out before the dementia finished with him. The arithmetic of what was preserved against what was lost does not produce a comfortable number. This story is honest about that. Chapter 9. What this story is really about. Dead Space 2 has been described, in the years since its release, primarily as a survival horror game with strong character work, improved mechanics, and a more ambitious setting than its predecessor. These descriptions are accurate. They are also, in aggregate, a way of understanding the game that leaves its most specific achievement unaddressed. The most specific achievement is this: Dead Space 2 is one of the very few horror stories in any medium that places institutional exploitation of a traumatized person at the center of its narrative, and then follows the logic of that exploitation all the way through to its conclusion without softening what the logic demands, and without allowing the protagonist to resolve the institutional problem through the same action that resolves his personal one. Isaac Clarke destroys the marker and escapes the Sprawl. He does not dissolve the research program that built the marker, because an individual cannot dissolve a research program through an act of physical survival, and the story knows this, and says so directly through the Overseer's post-credits transmission. This specificity is worth examining carefully, because it places Dead Space 2 in a particular tradition of horror that is not primarily about what monsters do to people, but about what institutions do to people. The distinction matters because the two categories of horror operate on different registers of the audience's experience and require different analytical frameworks to fully understand. Monster horror, at its core, addresses vulnerability. The creature is faster, stronger, more resilient, or less predictable than the human it is pursuing, and the horror derives from the asymmetry between human fragility and the creature's capacity for harm. The audience identifies with the human's fragility because they share it. What the monster does to the human body makes visible something that everyday life keeps out of conscious attention: the body's fundamental precariousness, its dependence on conditions remaining stable in ways it cannot control. Institutional horror operates differently. The institution is not faster or stronger than the individual in the same direct physical sense. It is more persistent, better resourced, insulated from individual consequence, capable of acting across longer time frames than any individual decision-maker can personally sustain. and able to absorb individual acts of resistance as data rather than experiencing them as damage. The horror of institutional horror derives from the asymmetry between the individual's lifetime and the institution's continuity, between the individual's need for acknowledgement and the institution's structural indifference to individuals as such. Isaac Clarke versus the Necromorphs is monster horror. Isaac Clarke versus Project Telomere is institutional horror. Dead Space 2 runs both simultaneously, and the simultaneous running of them produces something that neither would produce alone, a story in which the individual's victory over the immediate physical threat is genuine and hard-won, and not sufficient to address the structural threat that created it. Understanding how this works requires looking at the specific mechanism by which Project Telomere harmed Isaac, beyond the simple facts of the extraction sessions and the memory suppression. The mechanism is the removal of his capacity to give or withhold informed consent to what was being done to him, sustained over a period long enough that by the time any opportunity for consent arose, the thing being consented to was already complete. Research on the psychology of consent in institutional contexts has consistently found that consent is not simply a formal declaration, but a social and relational process, one that requires specific conditions to be genuine rather than nominal. The person being asked to consent must have accurate information about what they are being asked to consent to. They must have the practical capacity to refuse without facing consequences that make refusal effectively impossible. They must be in a cognitive state that allows for meaningful deliberation rather than immediate crisis response, and they must have access to some form of redress if what they consented to turns out to be different from what was represented to them. Project Telomere violated every single one of these conditions in sequence. Isaac was given no information. He had no practical capacity to refuse, being sedated in a facility he did not know he was in. His cognitive state across most of those 3 years was exactly the kind of ongoing crisis that makes meaningful deliberation impossible. And the redress available to him, should he discover what had been done, was limited to whatever he could accomplish inside a necromorph outbreak on a station run by the people who had been running the program. The elimination of consent as a real condition, rather than a formality to be documented and then bypassed, is the specific harm that institutional programs of this kind produce that is most difficult to address after the fact, because it is not locatable in any single act. No individual session of the Noonlight diagnostics machine was, by itself, the complete harm. The complete harm was the accumulated 3 years during which Isaac's body and brain were used as instruments for purposes he had not chosen and could not have chosen, and during which the information being extracted from him was being used to construct something that would eventually consume everyone in his proximity. The harm happened across time, through a series of decisions that each required institutional authorization, and each left no single responsible individual who could be identified as the author of the complete damage. This is precisely the structure that makes institutional harms so difficult to account for in any framework designed primarily to address individual wrongdoing. Who is responsible for what Project Telomere did to Isaac Clarke? Tiedemann authorized it and oversaw it. Foster Edgars conducted the sessions and managed the suppressant protocols. Kinner Phelps extracted and translated the neural data. The research staff who built the Site-12 marker from that data implemented the blueprints. The Overseer's command structure approved and resourced the program. EarthGov, as a governing body, provided the institutional authorization that made all of it legally possible under whatever classification system concealed it from oversight. Every one of these entities shares some portion of the responsibility. Every one of them, if examined individually, can point to the layer above them or beside them as the authority that made the relevant decision. This distribution of responsibility across institutional layers is not incidental. It is a structural feature of how harmful programs manage to continue. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing about the administration of harm under totalitarian systems, developed the concept she called the banality of evil to describe the mechanism by which ordinary individuals become the administrators of extraordinary harm without experiencing themselves as particularly unusual or monstrous. The most important insight in Arendt's work on this subject was that the worst institutional harms are frequently not the product of individuals who are exceptionally cruel or uniquely motivated to cause suffering. They are the product of individuals doing their jobs, following the institutional logic they operate within, implementing the decisions made by those above them in a chain of command that has already decided the action is necessary, and declining to introduce the kind of friction that would slow or stop the process, because that friction is not part of their role as they understand it. Project Telomere's personnel were not, with possibly minor exceptions, exceptional people making exceptional choices. They were researchers, administrators, and technical staff operating within an institutional framework that had already decided the program was necessary, that had already absorbed the ethical costs of the methodology into its risk assessment, and that provided the day-to-day context in which what they were doing felt like work rather than atrocity. The extraction sessions were scheduled, the data was logged, the construction protocols were followed. Everyone reported to someone above them who had signed off on the parameters. The harm was real and complete and distributed across a structure in which no individual component was sufficient to produce it alone. Jordan Peele's film Get Out, released in 2017, offers one of the most precise recent explorations of this specific structural horror in any medium, and the comparison to Dead Space 2's Project Telomere is specific enough to be worth making directly. In Get Out, the Armitage family has developed a surgical procedure that allows them to implant the consciousness of an older white person into the body of a younger black person, relegating the original consciousness to a dissociative background state Peele calls the sunken place. The procedure requires a specific kind of subject, a person who can be maneuvered into the Armitage household, isolated from their external support network, and subjected to a hypnotic induction that removes their capacity to resist or communicate distress. The family maintains the performance of welcome, warmth, and good intentions throughout the preparation process, using the social architecture of hospitality to manage the subject's access to information about their actual situation. The structural parallel to what EarthGov did with Isaac is not in the specific technology or the specific ideology, but in the general architecture, an institution that identified a human being as a vehicle for something it wanted, developed a method of accessing what it wanted from that person, while neutralizing the person's capacity to object, maintained the performance of legitimate purpose throughout, and distributed the harm across enough institutional layers that no single actor needed to experience themselves as the agent responsible for the complete damage. Peele's film is specifically about race in America, and the parallel is not meant to flatten the specific social and historical context that makes Get Out do what it does. The point of comparison is limited to the structural mechanism, the identification of a person's unique attributes as a resource worth extracting, the institutional choreography developed to make extraction possible without the person's knowledge or consent, and the way that choreography uses the forms of care and relationship as its cover. Isaac Clarke is not Chris Washington, but both are inside a structure that performed welcome while executing extraction, and both eventually had to navigate the full picture of what was happening to them without the institutional framework acknowledging any of it. The specific thing that the marker used from Isaac's mind, the neural encoding of its own blueprints, is in one sense a unique science fiction element with no direct real-world equivalent. In another sense, it is a precise metaphor for something that is documented in real-world research on the aftermath of non-consensual institutional research. The way that a person's exposure to a harmful program does not simply end when the program's formal operations end. The knowledge the marker imprinted in Isaac's brain was still there, still active, still generating dementia and hallucinations. 3 years after his direct marker contact ended, the extraction sessions had deepened the imprint rather than reducing it. The suppressants had managed the surface manifestations without touching the underlying signal. What EarthGov found in Isaac's brain when it read his neural data was not a passive record of past exposure. It was a living system that continued producing effects regardless of what was being done to manage those effects from the outside. Researchers studying trauma's neurological aftermath have documented a parallel process in human survivors of sustained institutional harm, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which describes the presentation of trauma-related symptoms in individuals who were exposed to prolonged, repeated, or systematic harm rather than a single acute event, produces neurological changes that are not simply memories of past harm, but active reorganizations of neural architecture around the harm experience. The brain of a person who survived sustained trauma does not contain a recording of what happened. It contains a rewiring that was produced by what happened, organized around the experience in a way that shapes perception, emotional response, and behavioral pattern long after the original experience has ended. The suppression of Isaac's explicit memory of the extraction sessions did not address this reorganization. It could not, because the reorganization was not stored in the explicit memory system that the suppressants were targeting. What the suppressants did was remove Isaac's conscious access to specific event memories while leaving the deeper structural changes in place, which is precisely why the dementia continued progressing despite the memory management. You cannot address a reorganization at the structural level by suppressing the surface-level symptoms that the reorganization produces. The harm and the management of the harm were operating on different systems, and EarthGov's program was sophisticated enough to access one and not sophisticated enough to reach the other. This is the dimension of Project Telomere that Tiedemann's logs do not address, and that the program's institutional framework apparently did not have a category for. The research was oriented toward the marker's signal as a thing that could be extracted from the subjects and built into a physical structure. The subjects as people whose neural architecture was being permanently altered by the program, and whose long-term well-being was a separate consideration from their continued availability as research material, were not the primary frame of reference. The psychologist Jennifer Freed developed a framework she called betrayal trauma theory to describe the specific psychological dynamics that arise when harm is inflicted by an institution or relationship that the harmed person is dependent on or embedded in. The central insight of this framework is that the psychological response to betrayal by a trusted institution is categorically different from the response to harm by an adversary, because the mechanisms that would ordinarily generate protective responses, recognition of danger, resistance, seeking external help, are compromised by the dependency relationship and by the social architecture of that relationship. A child harmed by a parent cannot simply recognize the danger and seek outside help in the way an adult harmed by a stranger can, because the relationship with the parent is the relationship the child depends on for survival, and the mind will protect that dependency relationship even at the cost of fully processing the harm being produced within it. Betrayal trauma theory describes the specific amnesia and disassociation that tends to develop in these situations, not as a malfunction, but as a functional adaptation, keeping the dependent relationship intact by keeping the harm below the level of full conscious recognition. Isaac's situation on Titan Station was not exactly the same as the child-parent configuration Freud's theory was originally developed to describe, but the structural dynamic it identifies, the way that institutional dependency compromises the mechanisms that would ordinarily generate protective responses to harm, is present in Isaac's situation in a modified form. Isaac could not recognize what was being done to him, because the institution doing it had removed his capacity to retain the memories that would have generated that recognition. The memory suppression was, functionally, EarthGov applying its own version of the betrayal trauma mechanism deliberately and pharmacologically. The effect it produced in Isaac, a person who could not recognize the harm being done to him by the institution nominally responsible for his care, was identical to what betrayal trauma theory describes as the adaptive mechanism that develops organically in people whose dependency relationships are the source of their harm. The difference is that EarthGov engineered the mechanism intentionally, rather than allowing it to develop as a protective adaptation, which makes it worse, in the specific sense that deliberate engineering of a harm-concealing mechanism by the perpetrator of the harm represents a different category of institutional behavior from the incidental production of adaptive forgetting in a dependent person. Tiedemann's program was not simply harming Isaac, it was actively maintaining the conditions that prevented Isaac from recognizing the harm. There is a moment partway through Dead Space 2 where Isaac, recovering a memory fragment from one of his sessions in the Noonlight diagnostics machine, processes the information with a kind of disoriented horror that is more specific than simple fear of the creature encounter that prompted the recovery. The horror is at the gap. 3 years of his own experience, his own perceptions and responses, and whatever he felt and thought and became during those years exist only in fragments that he cannot reliably access, in a sequence he cannot fully reconstruct, organized around events he was prevented from retaining. The horror is at the recognition that there is a version of himself across those 3 years that he will never be able to fully account for. This is not a horror that the Necromorphs produce. It is not a horror that Tiedemann's security forces produce. It is the horror of a person confronting an absence in their own history, a set of years that happened to them without their participation in anything like the full sense of what participation means. The straitjacket in the opening image was the physical expression of this. The missing 3 years are its psychological expression, and the recovery of those years, partial and fragmentary as it is throughout the game's events, is Isaac's actual arc, not the survival of the outbreak, which he was already doing in the opening minutes, but the reconstruction of enough of his own experience to stand in something like a complete relationship to his own history. He does not fully achieve this reconstruction. What he achieves is something more modest, enough recovery of the blocked memories to understand what was done to him and to make the decision, in full possession of that understanding, to destroy the thing that was built from him. The decision is his. The first genuinely unconstrained decision he has been positioned to make since the marker signal touched him. That, in the end, is what Dead Space 2 is about at the level that its genre mechanics are designed to deliver, not the survival of a single man in a terrible environment, the recovery of a single man's capacity to act on his own behalf, inside an environment where every institution arrayed around him, EarthGov, Unitology, the marker itself, had been working to either maintain his incapacity or redirect his capacity toward purposes other than his own. The marker, operating across its entire engagement with Isaac in this story, treated his grief for Nicole as the most reliable interface available to it. Grief is, in this reading, the marker's chosen entry point into Isaac's psychology, and the choice is not arbitrary. Grief is the condition in which a person's experience of their own continuity, their sense of themselves as a being with a persistent identity moving through time, is most disrupted. The person who is grieving is, in a specific sense, living through an experience that their prior self did not prepare for, and their present self cannot fully integrate. The future they had been anticipating, organized around the continuing existence of the person they have lost, suddenly does not exist in the form they expected. What exists instead is a gap, a silence, a restructuring of everything that was organized around the lost person. The marker found in Isaac's grief something it could work with, a gap in the architecture of a person's sense of continuous identity, exploitable as an insertion point for a signal that needed somewhere to establish itself in his psychology. The grief was already there. The marker made it operational, and the operational use of the grief did not make the grief itself less real or less genuinely Isaac's. It made it more complicated in a specific way, because every experience of grief that the marker's Nicole produced was simultaneously authentic emotional response and engineered manipulation, inseparable from each other, impossible to cleanly divide into which part belonged to Isaac and which part belonged to the signal. The destruction of the Nicole entity inside his mind does not resolve this inseparability cleanly. It removes the marker's operational version of the hallucination. What Isaac carries away from that confrontation is still the grief itself, the genuine loss, the unresolvable fact of a relationship ended before its natural conclusion, stripped now of the architecture the marker had built around it. The grief without the marker's manipulation is still grief. It is smaller in its immediate operational weight on his decision-making. It is not smaller in its emotional reality. This is the specific kind of ending this story earns, not the resolution of Isaac's grief, which would be both narratively dishonest and experientially false, but the separation of his grief from the thing that had been using it, returning it to him as something he carries because he loves someone and lost her, rather than as something that carries him toward outcomes he did not choose. A grief that belongs to you is not a comfortable thing to own. It is a less dangerous thing to own than a grief that belongs to something else. Chapter 10: The Signal That Keeps Moving. Isaac Clarke and Ellie Langford leave Titan Station behind them in a gunship moving away from the debris field of a collapsed civilization. Between them, they carry a combined damage inventory that neither of them has begun to fully assess. Behind them, transmitted in the quiet space between whatever is left of the Sprawl's infrastructure and whatever communications network the Overseer's command structure uses, a two-line transmission makes clear that the program is still running. The Overseer is not a character in the way that Tiedemann or Strauss or Ellie are characters. The Overseer is a presence, a voice, a proof of concept for the institutional continuity that the story has been describing in structural terms throughout its events. Individual characters die. Institutions do not die in the same way. The individual human beings who constitute an institution can be replaced, and the institution reconstitutes itself around the replacement, carrying forward the commitments and resources and embedded assumptions that preceded any of the individuals currently staffing it. This is the deepest structural feature of institutional horror that Dead Space 2 explores, and it is the one that the game's ending addresses most directly without any individual character needing to articulate it. The post-credits transmission does not require explanation. It simply demonstrates the thing it is describing. The program continues. The disaster at Site-12 has been absorbed as information about what went wrong, rather than as evidence that the program itself is the thing that went wrong. The Overseer's operational framing treats the Sprawl's destruction as a setback in a long-running project, not as the revelation of a fundamental problem with the project's design. This is consistent with how real institutional programs have historically processed catastrophic local failures. The organizations that have continued pursuing certain directions, despite individual disasters in that direction, have not generally done so because the people running them were uniquely resistant to evidence. They have done so because the institutional commitment to a direction is not simply the sum of the beliefs of the current individuals managing it. It is embedded in the resource allocation that was made before those individuals arrived, in the career trajectories that were built around contributing to the program, in the political relationships that were formed with external stakeholders who have interests in the program's continuation, and in the simple institutional inertia that any large organization develops around its existing directions regardless of the beliefs of its current members. Ending a major institutional program requires dismantling all of these simultaneously, which requires a different kind of leverage than any individual can generate through acts of survival and physical resistance, however impressive those acts are in their immediate context. Isaac destroyed the Site-12 marker. He did not have access to EarthGov's resource allocation decisions, career structure, political relationships, or institutional inertia. He addressed the local manifestation of the program and left its generating conditions intact. This is not a failure of Isaac Clarke. It is an honest description of what individuals can accomplish against institutions that are larger, more persistent, and better resourced than they are. The story does not frame Isaac's limited impact on the institutional level as something he should have done differently or tried harder to address. It frames it as a structural feature of the situation. The same structural feature that produces the Overseer's transmission, rather than a transmission acknowledging that the program is being discontinued. The tradition of horror that Dead Space 2 belongs to. The horror that locates its most fundamental threat in institutional rather than individual or supernatural evil, produces endings that are honest in this way because the alternatives are dishonest. An ending in which Isaac's survival also dissolved the research program, would require either that one individual's acts had effects on institutional structure that individuals' acts do not actually have, or that the program was less robustly designed than everything the story has demonstrated. Neither of these is available to a story that has spent its full runtime demonstrating exactly how institutions maintain their continuity against individual resistance. The other endings available in this tradition are darker still, stories in which the individual's resistance produces no meaningful disruption at all. Dead Space 2 occupies a middle position that is, in certain respects, the most difficult to articulate without sounding like a qualified defeat. Isaac accomplished something real and important and insufficient simultaneously. The marker is gone. The program continues. Both of these things are true. Both need to be held at once. John Carpenter's The Thing, from 1982, arrives at a related ending from a different direction. McReady and Childs at the conclusion of that film have, apparently, eliminated the immediate threat of the alien organism that consumed and replaced most of their Antarctic research team. They are also alone, wounded, in a burning station in a climate that will kill them before any rescue arrives, with no certainty that either of them has not been replaced by the creature. The victory is genuine. The situation following the victory offers nothing but the cold. Dead Space 2 is less bleak than this, not because it is less honest, but because Isaac's survival actually leads somewhere rather than terminating in the immediate conditions of his victory. He has Ellie. He has a ship. He has a destination, even if that destination is not yet determined. What he does not have is the resolution of the institutional conflict that produced everything he survived. There is a specific quality to the ending that Dead Space 2 earns, different from either a clean resolution or a bleak non-resolution, that comes from the precision of what Isaac recovers rather than what he defeats. He recovers his capacity for genuine decision-making. He recovers the ability to inhabit his own grief without being operated by it. He recovers the continuous thread of his own experience, fragmentary and damaged as that thread is, broken across the 3 missing years and the hallucination-saturated hours of the outbreak, but recognizably his in a way it was not, while the marker's signal was running it through its own agenda. The recovery of self-authorship after sustained institutional override is not a subject that most horror stories address directly, because most horror stories are organized around immediate threats and physical survival. What Dead Space 2 does, by placing Isaac's 3 missing years and the marker's use of his grief at the center of its story, is make self-authorship the actual subject of its horror. The Necromorphs are terrifying, and they kill people, and they kill them in ways that are graphically horrible. But the horror that the story is actually organized around is the horror of a man who spent 3 years as a construction material without knowing it, and who has to navigate the aftermath of that experience while simultaneously navigating everything the construction produced. The marker, understood this way, functions as a metaphor for trauma that propagates. The original marker on Aegis 7 produced a religion organized around a false account of its founding. That religion, 3 centuries later, is producing unitologist agents willing to start necromorph outbreaks in densely populated civilian stations to accelerate a convergence they have decided is divine. EarthGov's encounter with the markers produced an institutional commitment to marker research that survived every disaster the research program produced. Isaac's encounter with the marker on Aegis 7 produced a dementia and a set of imprinted blueprints that 3 years later produced the Site-12 marker. The Site-12 marker produced the Sprawl's destruction. Each marker leaves traces in the systems it touches, institutional and biological, that propagate forward through time, generating new markers and new disasters from the material of old ones. The name telomere is worth returning to in this light. Telomeres are the structures that limit how far cellular reproduction can propagate before something begins to break down. Project Telomere was looking for a way to extend that limit, to push human civilization's effective lifespan beyond what the current resource trajectory would support. What it produced instead was a demonstration of the opposite dynamic, the marker's propagating signal, moving from artifact to human mind to research program to constructed marker and back again, behaves more like a replicating system than a contained technology. It spreads. It extends itself through whatever material is available. It uses the institutional structures that try to control it as vectors for its own continuation, the same way a parasite uses the biology of its host not just for nutrition, but for reproduction. The parasitoid model from biology, in which an organism lays its reproductive material inside a host organism and then uses the host's own biological systems to complete its development, is perhaps the most specific biological analogy for what the markers do with the institutions and minds that encounter them. The host does not recognize the parasitoid's presence until the development is sufficiently advanced that recognition comes too late to prevent completion. The host's own resources are redirected toward something that will, eventually, consume the host as the final stage of its development. Every person who believes they are studying the markers for their own purposes, from Unitology's earliest theologians through EarthGov's most recent program directors, has been in the position of a host organism that has not yet recognized what it is incubating. Isaac Clarke, having navigated this from the inside of the most intimate possible relationship to the process, carries a specific and hard-won understanding that almost no one else in the Dead Space universe has access to. He was the construction material. He was the host. He was the target of the marker's most precisely calibrated manipulation, and he survived, with enough of his own mind intact, to understand what had been done to it, and to destroy the specific manifestation of what he had been used to build. That understanding, and the experience of having operated from inside the marker's process rather than simply observing it from outside, is the thing that makes Isaac Clarke specifically useful to the events of the subsequent Dead Space story, in ways that the Overseer's program is also apparently aware of. The Sprawl is gone. The Site-12 marker is destroyed. The people who were inside it when it mattered are mostly dead. 2 people who should not have survived are escaping in a gunship above the ruins of a city that was, the previous morning, a civilization. One of them lost 3 years and an eye and a man she was beginning to trust. The other lost 3 years and a woman he never finished grieving, and the version of himself that existed before any marker ever touched his mind. What both of them have, moving away from the debris field, is each other and the continued capacity to make choices, which is more than most of the 1 million people who live there can say. The signal from the Overseer's station is already being processed into a response. The other sites are already receiving their updated parameters. Somewhere in the Dead Space universe, a program that has been running for 3 years at Site-12 will resume at a different location with adjusted protocols. The marker's propagating logic will find new institutions to work through, new minds whose specific grief or guilt or hope it can read clearly enough to build an interface from. That continuation is not a comfort. It is not meant to be. This story was never trying to offer comfort. It was trying to offer honesty about the specific kind of world its universe contains, about what institutions do to individuals when the institutional need is large enough and the individual is sufficiently isolated, and the institutional justification is sufficiently self-reinforcing. The honesty is the thing of value this story produces, and it is the reason that Dead Space 2, 15 years after its release, continues to be worth this kind of close attention. Isaac Clarke survived the Ishimura. He survived Titan Station. He survived 3 years of Project Telomere's management of his unconscious mind, and several hours of the marker's active manipulation of his grief. He survived what the marker built from him. He will carry the damage of all of it for the rest of whatever life he navigates from this point. Chapter 11. What the Sprawl Cost. There is a quality to the wreckage left behind by institutional disasters that is different from the wreckage left behind by natural ones. When an earthquake destroys a city, the investigation that follows is organized around understanding the geological event, improving the engineering standards of future construction, and modeling better early warning systems. The loss is enormous and the harm is real, but the accountability structure points toward the natural forces involved and the human decisions that place people in proximity to those forces. When an institution destroys a city, the investigation that follows, if one follows at all, is organized around the institution's internal documentation, the chain of command, the decision makers at each level, and the question of whether any of those decision makers can be held individually responsible for their portion of the harm. The second investigation is almost always less satisfying than the first. It almost always produces less accountability in proportion to the damage, and it almost always generates more documentation of how the decisions were made than acknowledgement of what those decisions did to the people they were made about. The Sprawl's destruction will not produce a full investigation. The institution responsible for the program that caused it is the same institution that would conduct the investigation. The Overseer's transmission establishes this clearly. The information about Site-12's destruction is being processed by the command structure that authorized and resourced Site-12, and the processing takes the form of operational recalibration rather than external accountability. There is no independent body with the authority and the access to examine what happened on Titan Station and hold the relevant portions of EarthGov's hierarchy responsible for what those portions chose to do. This is not a feature of the Dead Space universe that is absent from the real world. The history of institutional programs that caused widespread harm and were investigated primarily by affiliated or overlapping bodies is long enough to constitute its own field of study. What that history consistently finds is that investigations without genuine independence from the institution being investigated produce findings that protect institutional continuity rather than individual accountability, and that the reforms they recommend are designed to make the program run more efficiently in the future rather than to address the fundamental assumptions that caused the harm in the first instance. The 1 million people of the Sprawl had no access to the information that would have allowed them to evaluate the risk they were living inside. The classification system that protected Project Telomere from civilian scrutiny was the same system that prevented those civilians from making informed decisions about where to live and work, about what the unusual accident patterns in the Titan mines meant, about why the behavioral health incidents in the residential sectors nearest the government sector had been ticking upward for the past year. The information existed. It was inside the government sector's locked research logs. The people whose lives depended on it were on the other side of the classification barrier. This is a harm that is done to people in addition to whatever physical harm an institutional disaster produces. The removal of their capacity to accurately assess and respond to the risks they are embedded in, through deliberate restriction of the information that accurate assessment would require. A person who knows there is an active marker research program in the facility beneath their city can make an informed decision about whether to remain in that city. A person who does not know this is making what appears to be an informed decision about a city that appears to be an ordinary city, in which the primary risks are the ordinary risks of urban life. The information restriction does not simply keep the program secret. It renders the civilian population incapable of genuine consent to the risk of living in proximity to it. This is the dimension of institutional harm that the Sprawl's disaster illustrates at the largest possible scale. 1 million people who had no access to the information that would have allowed them to refuse what was being built around them. Their inability to refuse was not the result of cowardice or indifference or ignorance about the general concept of risk. It was the result of a specific institutional decision to maintain their ignorance as a condition of the program's operation. Isaac Clarke's individual situation, with its 3 years of extracted memories and the specific architecture of what was done to his mind, was the most intimate expression of this broader pattern. The same removal of informed consent that applied to the Sprawl's civilian population applied to him at a neurological level rather than an informational one. Both he and the 1 million people around him were embedded in a structure whose consequences they could not have evaluated accurately because the institution responsible for those consequences had taken deliberate steps to prevent evaluation. The scale is different. The mechanism is the same. Examining what the story leaves in Isaac's hands after the marker's destruction requires more care than a straightforward accounting of losses, because the currency being measured is not the conventional one. Isaac does not emerge from the sprawl with resources, recognition, institutional redress, or any of the ordinary markers of having survived a wrongful situation successfully. He emerges with a functional mind, a surviving companion, a ship, and a significantly reduced dementia burden. Against everything that was spent to produce those outcomes, it is a very spare return. What he also carries is knowledge that is, in the context of the Dead Space universe, genuinely rare. Understanding the marker's approach to a human psychology from the inside, having experienced its manipulation of grief and guilt as operational strategy rather than random psychological degradation, having been present at the actual moment of a convergence event's initiation and having disrupted it through the specific mechanism of reclaiming authorship of his own mind, these constitute an experiential understanding that no amount of academic or institutional study of the markers from the outside could produce. Tiedemann spent years reading Isaac's neural data. He did not thereby acquire Isaac's knowledge. He acquired the marker's blueprint. Isaac has something different, an embodied understanding of how the marker works from the perspective of someone who was inside its process. This is the thing that the Overseer's program presumably already knows and is already accounting for in whatever plans are being developed at the other sites. Isaac Clarke is not simply a destroyed research installation's primary research subject who survived. He is a source of information about the marker's operational behavior from a perspective that the research program never successfully accessed through its extraction methodology, because extracting someone's neural data is not the same as extracting their understanding of the experience of being navigated by the marker's signal. The data is not the understanding. The blueprint is not the same as knowing what it felt like to build what the blueprint describes. There is a metaphor sitting inside this distinction that is worth making explicit rather than leaving as implication. The difference between the neural data EarthGov extracted from Isaac and the experiential knowledge he carries out of the sprawl is the difference between a photograph of a place and having been there. A photograph captures the visual data of the location, renders it into a reproducible form, and transmits that form to people who have not been to the place. Having been to the place generates something the photograph cannot, the embodied understanding of how the place felt to be inside, the specific quality of its light and sound and air, the way the space organized itself around a body moving through it, rather than a lens recording it. The photograph is enormously useful. The embodied understanding cannot be extracted from the person who has it, cannot be rendered into data without losing the properties that make it specifically valuable, and cannot be transmitted to someone who has not been there through any medium the person who has been there can access. Isaac's embodied knowledge of the marker's internal logic, of the specific texture of its manipulation, of what it feels like to be navigated by a grief-shaped hallucination with an alien agenda, is the photograph's inverse. EarthGov has the data, Isaac has the knowledge, and the knowledge, as subsequent Dead Space stories demonstrate, is the thing that makes it possible to actually address the markers in ways that the data alone cannot support. The Sprawl's civilian population, of course, does not get to carry anything out of the disaster. 1 million people do not get a metaphor or an earned hard-won understanding or the specific resilience that surviving the most intimate possible encounter with an alien signal can generate in someone whose mind it failed to fully consume. They get what mass casualty events produce for their victims, an end, various and immediate, without the narrative significance that comes from being the person the story chose to follow. Horror stories require a perspective, and the perspective requires a survivor. The Sprawl's dead are the environment in which the survivor's story happened, and the story does not pretend otherwise, but neither does it pretend that the environment was incidental. Ellie Langford's presence at the end of this story is the one element that prevents the ending from collapsing into pure solitary survival, and understanding why her presence matters requires looking at what she represents across this story's events rather than simply what she does in them. She is the character who navigated the Sprawl's disaster without access to any of the background information that might have explained what she was navigating, without the specific resilience that marker exposure provides to its hosts, and without any institutional affiliation that gave her more information about what was happening than the evidence of her own senses. She survived entirely on competence, situational intelligence, and the speed of her own decision-making in an environment that was consuming everyone around her. Her survival is, in that sense, a demonstration of something that the story's institutional analysis is in danger of obscuring, that individual capacity, practical and embodied and uncomplicated by either alien signal or institutional commitment, is a genuinely different thing from any of the forces that were competing over the Sprawl's space and bodies and minds. Ellie does not save Isaac in spite of what she went through. She saves him because she is exactly the kind of person who makes the decision to crash a gunship through a facility ceiling when the alternative is leaving someone behind, and makes that decision in the time it takes to identify it as the right call without the philosophical overlay that the marker's influence layers over every decision Isaac has been making since long before the outbreak began. Her uncontaminated decisiveness is the specific thing Isaac's situation required, and the story gives it to her without diminishing the cost she paid for the competence that produced it. Their departure from the Sprawl in the gunship is a beginning rather than a conclusion, which is consistent with the kind of story Dead Space 2 is. Stories organized around the recovery of self-authorship, rather than around the defeat of a specific threat, do not end at the defeat of the threat. They end at the moment when the protagonist has enough of themselves back to choose what comes next. Isaac, having destroyed the Nicole hallucination and the marker with it, having processed the 3 missing years into something approximating an integrated account of his own recent history, having made the decision to stay behind and attempt the thing that needed doing, rather than escaping with Ellie when the escape was still available, is capable of choosing what comes next, in a way he was not capable of at the story's opening. The straitjacket is gone. The marker's operational grip on his grief is gone. The 3 years of managed ignorance are as recovered as they are going to be. What comes next, in the universe this story inhabits, is going to be difficult in ways that are not fully visible from the vantage point of the escaping gunship. The convergence agenda is ongoing. The other sites are recalibrating. Whatever the markers are ultimately working toward, the full architecture of which requires the events of Dead Space 3 to begin to clarify, is not resolved by the Site-12 marker's destruction. Isaac is not done. He knows he is not done. The story ends before he has to confront what not being done means, because the ending it earned is the one that closes at the moment of recovered agency, rather than at the moment of complete resolution. Complete resolution is not available in this universe. The marker's propagating logic does not produce complete resolution. The institution's continuity does not produce complete resolution. The grief Isaac carries, genuine and now at least partly his own again, does not produce complete resolution. What is available is the capacity to continue, with accurate information about what has been done, and what remains to be done, and what the cost of doing it is likely to be. Isaac Clarke has that capacity at the story's ending, in a way he did not have it at the beginning. Measured against what it cost to acquire it, that is an enormous thing. Measured against the million people who cannot acquire anything because they are gone, it is a small thing. The story holds both measurements simultaneously and declines to resolve the tension between them, which is the honest move. It is also the move that keeps this story worth returning to, in any medium, at any point after the events it describes. Stories that resolve this tension cleanly lie about something important. Stories that maintain it are closer to what the experience of surviving institutional harm actually looks like from the inside. A genuine recovery that does not and cannot account for what was destroyed in the process of making that recovery possible. Dead Space 2 is, finally, a story about what it cost to get your own mind back. The cost is the Sprawl. The cost is Strauss, whose fate Isaac carries with him. The cost is 3 years that Isaac will reconstruct for the rest of his life from fragments and recovered logs and the specific texture of the damage they left in his neural architecture. The cost is the version of Isaac Clarke, who existed before any marker ever touched him, the man who was going to go to the Ishimura, sort out a communications problem, apologize to his girlfriend for a fight he regrets, and return to a life organized around the things he chose rather than the things the marker chose for him. That version of Isaac did not survive the Ishimura. The version of Isaac who survived the Ishimura did not survive Titan Station in anything like his prior form. What survives Titan Station is something more specific. A man who knows what was done to him, who chose to destroy rather than serve what was built from him, and who is capable of making the next choice without the marker's hand on his grief. That is enough. In a universe where the markers keep propagating, and the institutions keep recalibrating, and the overseer's program keeps running, a person who maintains the capacity to make genuine choices in full possession of accurate information is the closest thing available to a victory. Dead Space 2 knows this, and says so directly through the architecture of its ending. It does not make it comfortable, it makes it true. Chapter 12. Why this universe keeps pulling us back. Horror has always been the genre most willing to tell the truth about the things that official culture prefers to manage at a distance. The alien invasion story tells the truth about the fear of cultural replacement. The slasher film tells the truth about the vulnerability of the body and the speed with which social environments can turn hostile. The haunted house story tells the truth about how the past exerts structural force on the present in ways that the people inside the structure cannot always perceive or name. Dead Space tells the truth about institutions, about what happens when the organizational logic that a civilization develops for managing its resources is applied to the humans inside that civilization, as though they too are resources to be managed. This is not a comfortable truth to sit with. It is also not a distant or purely speculative one. The history of the 20th century is substantially the history of institutions applying resource management logic to human beings, generating harm at scales that individual human cruelty could not have produced without the organizational infrastructure that made it scalable. The history of the 21st century continues this, in forms that are more distributed and more difficult to locate in specific institutional actors, but no less real in their effects. The structures that treat people as materials, as data, as vehicles for purposes that the people themselves have not chosen, are not fictional inventions. They are documented realities that most people spend most of their lives embedded in to some degree, usually without the dramatic clarity of a necromorph outbreak to make the embedding visible. Dead Space 2's specific contribution to horror's ongoing conversation about institutional harm is the intimacy of its framing. The institutional horror genre, at its broader scale, often addresses populations, the systematic harm of groups defined by race, class, religion, or geography. Dead Space 2 addresses one person, one man's mind, extracted and used and manipulated and eventually recovered, scaled up to the level of cosmic stakes through the mechanism of the marker's propagating logic. The intimacy is the point. The intimacy is what makes the institutional analysis experientially real rather than abstractly political, because Isaac's situation is navigable as a felt experience in a way that abstract analysis of institutional harm never quite is. The audience that follows lore videos about Dead Space at 11 o'clock at night, in the dark, with the lights low, is not looking exclusively for plot summary or game mechanics analysis. There is something in this universe that meets a real need, and the people who keep returning to it are worth taking seriously about what that something is. Horror selected for ambient listening, the format this channel works in, is horror that accompanies a person rather than confronting them, that creates a mood space where difficult ideas become approachable because they are enclosed in narrative rather than presented as direct challenges. The Dead Space universe, in this format, offers a set of ideas about institutional behavior and individual survival, and the mechanics of grief that would be considerably harder to approach as a formal argument. This matters because the ideas are real, and the stakes of understanding them are real. How institutions treat the people inside them is not an abstraction. How grief gets used by systems that benefit from keeping it unresolved is not an abstraction. how the removal of informed consent operates as a mechanism for harm across timeframes longer than any individual crisis response can address, is not an abstraction. Dead Space 2 processes all of these through the specific grammar of science fiction horror, and the processing makes them accessible in ways that other registers cannot. The lore of this franchise is worth the kind of close attention this video has tried to give it, because the franchise is worth the attention. The monsters are spectacular, and the horror is visceral, and the gameplay is genuinely excellent, and none of that is the deepest reason this universe generates the kind of sustained engagement that brings people back to it over and over, years after the games were released, in the dark, looking for something to make sense of something they cannot quite name. What Dead Space 2 offers, examine this carefully, is a story about a man who survived being turned into raw material and came out the other side, still capable of making choices. In a world organized around institutions that consistently treat the people inside them as means rather than ends, that story has a specific gravity. It is not comfort. The Sprawl is still gone. The Overseer's program is still running. Isaac Clarke is still carrying damage he will live with for however long he continues to live. But the choice, at the end, is his. In the specific economy of what this story is trading in, that is the whole of the value being offered. The choice is his. He makes it. Everything else is what surrounds and precedes and follows from that single fact.